Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. My father died 3 years ago from lung cancer, a quiet man who'd spent most of his adult life working as a civilian contractor after retiring from the Air Force in 1987. He'd served 22 years, mostly at bases I'd never heard of, doing work he rarely talked about. When I was growing up, if I asked him about his military service, he'd give short answers about radar systems and communications equipment, then change the subject to baseball or my grades or anything else that would steer the conversation away from whatever he'd done in those years before I was born. After the funeral, my mother, my sister, and I spent weeks going through his belongings, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions that somehow seemed both too much and not nearly enough to represent a person's existence. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: old tools, faded photographs, boxes of paperwork related to insurance and taxes, and all the mundane bureaucracy of living. But in the back of his bedroom closet, behind winter coats he hadn't worn in years, we found a small fireproof safe that none of us knew existed. The combination was written on a piece of tape stuck to the back in my father's careful handwriting. Inside were his military records, some savings bonds, and a stack of notebooks, maybe a dozen composition books with black and white covers, the kind students use in school. There was also a letter, sealed in an envelope with "For my family," written on the outside in the same neat script. My mother opened it while my sister and I watched, and she read it silently before looking up at us with an expression I'd never seen before: confusion mixed with something that might have been fear. "He says these are his journals from his time in the service," she said quietly, "but he's written here that we should never read them." My sister, always the practical one, asked why he'd kept them if he didn't want us to read them. My mother read further into the letter. "He says he was ordered to keep records, and that destroying them would have been a violation of his oath. But he also says that what he wrote down wasn't meant for civilian eyes, even family." We took the journals home along with the rest of his belongings, but we honored his request. For 3 years, those notebooks sat in my garage, still in the fireproof safe, still unread. Occasionally, one of us would mention them, usually during family gatherings when we were sharing memories of Dad, but we'd agreed to respect his wishes. That changed last month when my mother had a stroke. She's recovering well, but the experience of nearly losing her so soon after losing Dad made me realize how much family history was disappearing with each generation. My father had been the last person alive who remembered his parents, the last one who knew stories about our family that went back to the early 1900s. When my mother is gone, those stories will be gone too. I started thinking about the journals differently. Maybe Dad's warning was about protecting us from military secrets or classified information that could get us in trouble. But maybe, I reasoned, Enough time had passed that whatever he'd been involved in was no longer sensitive, and maybe understanding what he'd experienced would help me understand why he'd been so quiet about his service, why he'd sometimes get a distant look in his eyes when military stories came on the news. I didn't tell my mother or my sister what I was planning. I just went to the garage one Saturday morning, opened the safe, and took out the first journal in the stack. It was dated 1979 to 1980, when Dad would have been stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. I sat in my car in the driveway and opened to the first page. The early entries were exactly what I expected. Routine observations about weather, duty assignments, personnel changes. Dad had neat handwriting and a methodical approach to record keeping, noting details about radar maintenance schedules and communications protocols with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone with a technical background. It was boring, frankly, and I started to think that his warning had been unnecessary. But as I read deeper into that first journal, the tone began to change. The entries became less routine and more personal, and Dad started writing about things that didn't sound like normal military operations. November 12th, that's 1979, third incident this month. Radar contact at 02 or 30 hours. Multiple objects moving at impossible speeds. Colonel Morrison ordered immediate stand-down of tracking systems. Told radar crew to log it as equipment malfunction. Objects departed vertically at speeds that would have destroyed any known aircraft. I stopped reading and looked around my neighborhood, suddenly aware of how normal everything looked. Kids playing in yards, neighbors washing cars, the ordinary Saturday morning routine of suburban life. Then I looked back at the journal and read the entry again, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood what my father had written. But the words were clear, written in his careful script, with no signs of haste or uncertainty. He was describing encounters with aircraft that performed in ways that defied physics, and he was recording orders to cover up these encounters. I turned the page and found more of the same. November 18th, 1979. Personnel from Washington arrived this morning, interviewed everyone who was on duty during last week's incident, made us sign additional security agreements. Specialist Johnson was transferred out within 24 hours. No explanation given. December 3rd, 1979. Visual confirmation tonight. I was on late shift when objects appeared on southern horizon. Watched through binoculars as 3 lights performed maneuvers that included right-angle turns at high speed and complete stops from apparent high velocity. No sound, no heat signature on infrared. Lasted approximately 12 minutes before objects accelerated straight up and disappeared. I spent the rest of that day reading through the first journal, and by evening I understood why my father had warned us not to read his records. He wasn't writing about routine military service. He was documenting his involvement in what appeared to be an ongoing program to monitor and cover up encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. The entries described a world where military personnel were regularly ordered to ignore evidence of aircraft that performed beyond the capabilities of any known technology. Dad wrote about radar operators being transferred to remote assignments after witnessing unusual activity, about cover stories designed to explain away incidents that defied explanation, about a parallel military structure that existed specifically to manage information about encounters with the unknown. But what disturbed me most was the gradual change in my father's tone as the journal progressed. The early entries were clinical and professional, recording facts with military precision. But as months passed, his writing became more personal, more troubled. He started questioning orders, wondering about the ethics of concealing information from the public, speculating about the true nature of what he was observing. February 14th, 1980. Another close encounter last night. Object landed approximately 2 miles from base perimeter. Ground team dispatched for investigation found physical evidence, soil samples, vegetation changes, geometric impressions in earth. All evidence confiscated by special team from Peterson AFB. Official report lists incident as weather balloon recovery. I'm starting to understand that we're not protecting national security. I opened the second journal, dated 1980-1981, and found that my father's assignment had changed. He'd been transferred to a facility in Nevada, to a base that wasn't listed in any of his official military records. The entries from this period described work on projects with code names I'd never heard of, involving the analysis of materials and technologies that he clearly believed were not of human origin. March 22nd, 1981. Lab work continues on samples from New Mexico incident. Material properties unlike anything in our databases. Conducts electricity at room temperature with zero resistance. Structural analysis shows molecular arrangements that our metallurgists say should be impossible to achieve with current technology. Dr. April 15, 1981, attended briefing on recovered aircraft sections. Propulsion system appears to be based on principles we don't understand. No visible engine components, no fuel systems, no exhaust mechanisms. Yet flight characteristics observed in field suggest controlled anti-gravity effects. The journals from his Nevada assignment read like science fiction, but they were written with the same careful attention to detail that characterized all of my father's work. He documented materials that defied known physics, recorded conversations with scientists who were struggling to understand technologies that seemed decades or centuries ahead of human development, and described a growing realization that the military was in possession of evidence that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. But he also wrote about the psychological toll of this work, the isolation of being part of a program that required him to lie to family and friends about his duties, the stress of possessing knowledge that he was forbidden to share. As the years progressed, his entries became darker, more conflicted. June 8th, 1983, received orders for new assignment back to conventional duties. Being transferred to Communications Squadron at Minot SAFB. Dr. Patterson says this is standard procedure. They rotate personnel out of special projects after extended periods to prevent psychological breakdown. I should be relieved, but I feel like I'm abandoning the most important work I'll ever do. The final journals covered his years at conventional assignments, but even during routine duties, he continued to encounter the unknown. Reports of unusual aerial activity crossed his desk regularly, and he found himself part of a network of military personnel who were aware that standard explanations for these incidents were inadequate. He wrote about the frustration of knowing the truth while being required to perpetuate official denials. January 17th, 1985, commercial pilot reported large triangular aircraft over Michigan last night. No flight plan, no transponder, no communication with air traffic control. Radar showed object traveling at 2,000 mph before disappearing from screens. Pilot was debriefed and asked to sign confidentiality agreement. Official explanation will be atmospheric anomaly. The last entry in the final journal was dated just a few months before his retirement in 1987. September 4th, 1987, 22 years of service ending soon. I've been part of something extraordinary and terrible. Extraordinary because we've had contact with intelligences that represent the next stage of technological evolution. Terrible because we've chosen to hide this knowledge from the people who have a right to know. I understand the reasons: social stability, religious implications, economic disruption. But I also understand that we're denying humanity the chance to grow, to evolve, to take its place in a larger community of intelligent beings. I closed the last journal and sat in my car as the sun set behind my neighbors' houses, trying to process what I'd learned about my father's life. He hadn't been a radar technician working on routine communications equipment. He'd been part of an ongoing program to study and conceal evidence of non-human intelligence, a keeper of secrets that challenged everything we think we know about our place in the universe. I understood now why he'd warned us not to read these records. It wasn't just about protecting classified information. It was about protecting us from knowledge that would fundamentally change how we see the world. Once you know that governments possess proof of advanced non-human technology, once you understand that official denials are deliberate deceptions, you can never look at the news or official statements the same way again. I've decided to honor my father's wishes and not share these journals with anyone else. I've read them, and I can't unread them, but I won't burden my mother or sister with knowledge that my father believed was too dangerous for civilian minds. Some secrets are kept not to protect the government, but to protect the people who have to live in the world that governments create. But I think about those journals every day now. I think about my quiet, methodical father spending decades carrying the knowledge that we are not alone in the universe, that we are being visited and studied by intelligences far more advanced than our own. I think about the thousands of military personnel who must have similar stories, similar secrets, similar burdens of knowledge that they can never share. And I think about the world we live in, where the most important truth in human history is hidden away in fireproof safes and classified files, kept from the people who have the most right to know it. My father served his country faithfully, but in the end, I think his greatest service was protecting us from a truth that he believed we weren't ready to handle. I just hope that someday we will be. I've always been a light sleeper, the kind of person who wakes up if a neighbor's dog barks 3 houses away, or if the refrigerator makes an unusual sound. So when I woke up at 2:47 a.m. to what sounded like a symphony of electronic devices all turning on at once, my first thought was that we were having some kind of power surge that had triggered every piece of equipment in the house. The sound was unmistakable: the startup chimes of computers, the brief musical notes that TVs make when they're powered on, the electronic beeps of microwave ovens, and coffee makers beginning their boot sequences. It was as if someone had walked through my house and manually turned on every device with a power button, all at the same moment. I lay in bed for a few seconds, listening to this electronic orchestra and trying to make sense of what was happening. My bedroom TV was displaying its startup screen, casting a blue glow across the walls. I could hear my laptop in the home office playing its Windows startup sound, and from downstairs came the distinctive hum of the kitchen appliances cycling through their initialization routines. My first concern was electrical. Maybe a power surge had somehow activated everything simultaneously. But as I became more alert, I realized that this explanation didn't make sense. A power surge would be more likely to damage equipment than to turn it on in an organized fashion. And the timing was too perfect, too coordinated to be the result of random electrical fluctuations. I got out of bed and walked through the house, checking each room to assess the situation. Every electronic device I owned was active and running. The living room TV was on the home screen. The stereo system was powered up with its display showing the time, and even small appliances, like the coffee maker and toaster oven, were illuminated with their LED status lights. In my home office, both of my computers were running, their monitors bright with desktop wallpapers I hadn't seen in months. The printer was going through its startup routine, moving its print head back and forth with mechanical precision. Even devices I rarely used, an old tablet charging on a shelf, a portable radio on top of a bookcase, were all active and operational. What made this even more puzzling was that many of these devices had been unplugged when I went to bed. I'm careful about power consumption and have a habit of unplugging electronics I'm not actively using. The TV in the guest bedroom, for instance, had its power cord coiled neatly on the floor beside the entertainment center. The coffee maker's cord was draped over the kitchen counter, nowhere near an outlet. Yet both devices were somehow running, their displays bright and their systems fully operational. I checked the electrical outlets throughout the house, thinking maybe I was misremembering what I'd left plugged in. But I found power cords lying unplugged exactly where I'd left them, while the devices they were supposed to connect were running on what appeared to be no power source at all. The old portable radio in my office was playing static from a station it had found, despite sitting on a shelf with its power cord wrapped around its base. I tried turning things off manually, pressing power buttons and switches to shut down the various devices. Some of them responded normally, powering down with their usual shutdown sequences. Others seemed to ignore my attempts to turn them off, continuing to run as if they were receiving power from some invisible source. The kitchen microwave, for example, kept displaying its clock and responding to button presses, even after I'd confirmed multiple times that its power cord was unplugged and lying on the counter. By this point, I was feeling genuinely unsettled. This wasn't just an electrical anomaly, it was a violation of basic physics. Electronic devices don't run without power sources, and they certainly don't turn themselves on in perfect synchronization while unplugged. I considered calling an electrician, but what would I tell them? That my house was full of ghosts in the machine? I decided to document what I was seeing, using my phone to take photos and videos of unplugged devices that were clearly running. The images looked surreal, TV screens glowing with their power cords visibly disconnected, computer monitors displaying screensavers, while their power cables lay coiled on the floor nearby. If I hadn't been experiencing it myself, I would have assumed the photos were faked. Around 3:30 a.m., I noticed that the devices were beginning to behave strangely in other ways. The TV in the living room started cycling through channels on its own, changing stations every few seconds in a rapid, methodical progression. My laptop began opening and closing applications in what seemed like a random pattern, though there was something almost purposeful about the sequence. Email programs, web browsers, document editors, all opening briefly before closing again. The kitchen appliances started their own mysterious routines. The microwave began running brief heating cycles with nothing inside, its turntable rotating for exactly 30 seconds before stopping. The coffee maker initiated a brewing cycle despite having no water in its reservoir, going through all the motions of making coffee while producing nothing but the mechanical sounds of its internal pumps and valves. Most unsettling was the way the devices seemed to be communicating with each other. When the TV changed channels, the stereo system would adjust its volume. When my laptop opened a new application, the printer would feed a blank sheet of paper through its mechanisms. There was a coordination to their behavior that suggested they were operating according to some kind of shared protocol, following instructions that were invisible to me. I tried unplugging my router and modem, thinking that maybe some kind of network intrusion was causing the coordinated behavior. But even with the internet connection severed, the devices continued their strange performances. They were operating independently of any external control system I could identify, powered by sources I couldn't detect, following patterns I couldn't understand. Around 4 a.m., the activity began to decrease. Devices started shutting down one by one, returning to their normal dormant states. The process was as synchronized as the initial activation had been. First, the kitchen appliances powered down, then the computers and printers, finally, the TVs and stereo equipment. Within 15 minutes, the house had returned to its normal quiet state, with only the usual ambient sounds of HVAC systems and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I spent the next hour checking every device, confirming that they were truly off and that their power cords were still unplugged where I'd left them. Everything appeared normal, as if the past 2 hours of impossible electrical activity had never happened. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the photos and videos on my phone, and even those looked less convincing in the pre-dawn darkness than they had while I was taking them. I barely slept for the rest of the night, lying in bed, listening for any sign that the phenomenon might resume, but the house remained quiet until my alarm went off at 7 a.m. I went through my normal morning routine, checking each electronic device as I encountered it. Everything worked normally, turning on when plugged in and switched on, staying off when disconnected from power. Over the following days, I researched everything I could find about unexplained electrical phenomena. I read about electromagnetic fields, solar storm effects, and various forms of electronic interference that might cause unusual device behavior. I even consulted with an electrician who examined my home's wiring and found everything to be properly installed and grounded. But none of the explanations I found could account for what I had experienced. Electromagnetic interference might cause devices to malfunction, but it wouldn't power them on while unplugged. Solar storms can disrupt communications and electrical grids, but they don't create the kind of coordinated, purposeful behavior I had witnessed. The incident happened 3 more times over the next month, always at night, always with the same synchronized activation of every electronic device in the house. Each time, I documented what I could, taking photos and videos of the impossible sight of unplugged devices running on invisible power. Each time, the devices performed their strange choreographed routines for about 2 hours before shutting down as mysteriously as they had activated. I noticed that the behavior was becoming more complex with each occurrence. During the fourth incident, my computers began displaying text documents that I hadn't created, filled with seemingly random strings of numbers and letters. The TV showed programming that wasn't available on any channel I received, grainy footage of landscapes I didn't recognize, accompanied by audio that sounded like data transmission rather than any human language. After the fourth incident, I decided to move out of the house temporarily, staying with friends while I tried to figure out what was happening. I installed security cameras and motion detectors, hoping to capture evidence of whatever was causing these electrical anomalies. But the phenomena stopped as soon as I left. The cameras recorded nothing unusual, and when I returned a week later, everything remained normal. It's been 6 months since the last incident, and I've gradually returned to my normal routines. The house feels ordinary again, with electronics behaving exactly as they should, requiring power sources, responding to manual controls, staying off when turned off. But I find myself checking power cords obsessively, making sure everything is properly plugged in or deliberately unplugged, as if the simple act of conscious decision making about electrical connections might prevent whatever happened from happening again. I still have the photos and videos from those nights, stored on my phone and backed up to multiple cloud services. Looking at them now, they seem almost mundane, just electronics running in a dark house. But I know what I experienced, the impossibility of it, the sense that my home had become a conduit for something that operated according to rules I couldn't comprehend. Sometimes I wonder if the phenomenon was trying to communicate something, if the coordinated behavior of my devices was actually a message encoded in electronic activity. The patterns were too complex and too purposeful to be random, but I never figured out how to decode whatever information might have been contained in those midnight performances. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened because I know how it sounds. Electronics turning on by themselves is the stuff of ghost stories and science fiction, not rational explanations for real events. But I know what I saw, what I documented, what disrupted my sleep and my sense of reality for those strange weeks when my house briefly became something more than just a collection of rooms and appliances. The experience left me with a permanent awareness that our everyday technology might be more mysterious than we assume, that the boundaries between the electronic and the unknown might be more porous than we like to believe. Every device in my house is now connected to something larger than its immediate function, part of a network that extends beyond anything I can see or understand, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. I never used to pay much attention to the night sky until my divorce was finalized and I found myself living alone for the first time in 15 years. The house felt too quiet, too empty, so I started spending evenings on the roof of my garage, lying on an old sleeping bag and looking up at the stars. It was peaceful in a way that the inside of the house wasn't, and gradually it became my nightly routine: dinner, dishes, then up the ladder to spend an hour or two watching the slow rotation of constellations above my suburban neighborhood. I live in a small city in northern Colorado, far enough from Denver that light pollution isn't too bad, but close enough that you can still see the glow on the southern horizon. From my rooftop, I had a clear view in all directions: the Front Range Mountains to the west, rolling plains to the east, and overhead on clear nights, more stars than most people ever take the time to notice. I'd been doing this for about 3 months when I started to learn the sky well enough to notice when something was different. I could recognize the major constellations, track the movement of planets, and spot satellites as they traced their predictable paths from horizon to horizon. The night sky, I discovered, follows patterns as reliable as clockwork, and once you know what to expect, anything unusual stands out immediately. It was a Thursday evening in late September when I first saw the star that shouldn't have been there. I was lying on my back, hands behind my head, watching the constellation Cassiopeia rise in the northeast. I knew that part of the sky well: 5 bright stars forming a distinctive W shape, surrounded by fainter stars that I'd learned to recognize over the summer. But that night, there was an extra star, brighter than it should have been, positioned just to the left of the constellation's center. My first thought was that it might be a planet. Mars and Jupiter are often bright enough to be mistaken for unusually brilliant stars, and their positions change slowly over the course of weeks and months. But I'd been tracking the planets with a star chart app on my phone, and nothing was supposed to be in that location. I checked the app anyway, holding the phone up to compare the screen with the actual sky, but it showed no planets, no bright stars, nothing that could account for what I was seeing. The new star was steady and white, noticeably brighter than anything else in that part of the sky. It didn't twinkle the way stars usually do when seen through atmospheric turbulence, and it didn't move like a satellite or aircraft. It simply sat there among the familiar stars of Cassiopeia, as if it had always belonged there. I watched it for about 20 minutes, occasionally checking my phone to see if the astronomy app could identify it. But according to every digital star chart I could find, that part of the sky should have been empty except for stars too faint to see with the naked eye. I was starting to think I might be looking at some kind of rare astronomical phenomenon when the star blinked at me. It wasn't a quick flicker like an aircraft navigation light, or the brief occlusion you might see when a satellite tumbles and reflects sunlight at different angles. This was a deliberate, unmistakable blink. The star dimmed to nothing, stayed dark for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to full brightness. Then it did it again and again. I sat up on the sleeping bag, staring at this impossible thing in the sky. Stars don't blink on command. They don't have internal light sources that can be turned on and off. They're massive fusion reactors millions of miles away, and their light reaches us as a steady stream that's been traveling through space for years. What I was seeing violated everything I understood about how the universe works. The blinking continued in a slow, steady rhythm. 2 seconds dark, 2 seconds bright, 2 seconds dark, 2 seconds bright. It was so regular, so obviously intentional, that I found myself holding my breath between each cycle. After about 10 blinks, the pattern changed. The star went dark for 4 seconds, then bright for 2, then dark for 4 again. Then it switched to rapid flashing, bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark, before returning to the original 2-second rhythm. I fumbled for my phone and started recording video, though I doubted the camera would be sensitive enough to capture what I was seeing. On the small screen, the star looked like just another point of light among many, and the blinking was barely visible. But with my naked eyes, it was unmistakable, a brilliant star turning itself on and off like a cosmic lighthouse. The display continued for another 15 minutes. Sometimes, the star would blink in simple patterns, sometimes in complex sequences that seemed to contain some kind of coded information. Occasionally, it would go dark for longer periods, and I would start to think the show was over, only to have it suddenly flare back to life with a new blinking pattern. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the blinking stopped. The star returned to its steady brightness and remained that way for the rest of the evening. I stayed on the roof until after midnight, waiting for it to do something else, but it behaved like a normal star for the remainder of the night. The next evening, I was back on the roof as soon as it got dark, looking for the mysterious star. It was there, in the same position relative to Cassiopeia, burning with the same steady white light. I watched it for over an hour, waiting for the blinking to resume, but nothing happened. It looked like an ordinary star, indistinguishable from the thousands of others scattered across the sky. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with that star. I researched variable stars, pulsars, and other astronomical phenomena that might explain periodic changes in brightness. I learned about binary star systems, where one star regularly passes in front of another, creating an eclipse effect. I read about stellar flares and novae and everything else that might cause a star to change its appearance over time. But none of it fit what I had observed. Variable stars change brightness over periods of hours, days, or years, not seconds. Pulsars flash incredibly rapidly, dozens or hundreds of times per second, not in the slow, deliberate patterns I had witnessed. And binary eclipses create gradual dimming and brightening, not the sharp on-off transitions I had seen. 3 weeks after the first incident, it happened again. Same star, same deliberate blinking, but with different patterns. This time, I was ready with a better camera, a digital SLR with a telephoto lens that I borrowed from a photographer friend. I managed to capture several minutes of video that clearly showed the star turning on and off, though the quality still wasn't good enough to make out fine details. I also tried something new. During one of the star's dark periods, I used a powerful LED flashlight to send my own blinking signal toward that part of the sky. 3 quick flashes, then 3 slow ones, then 3 quick again, the international SOS pattern. I felt ridiculous doing it, like a child flashing a toy at an airplane, but I was desperate to establish some kind of communication with whatever was responsible for this phenomenon. To my amazement, the star responded. After I finished my SOS sequence, it went through the same pattern: 3 quick blinks, 3 slow ones, 3 quick again. Then it resumed its previous blinking pattern, as if acknowledging my signal before continuing with its own agenda. I tried other patterns. 5 quick flashes. The star responded with 5 quick flashes, a sequence of long and short blinks that spelled out hello in Morse code. The star repeated it back perfectly. Whatever was controlling that light in the sky, it was intelligent, and it was paying attention to my attempts at communication. This continued for about an hour, the star and I exchanging simple signals like two ships passing in the night. I felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the realization that I was communicating with something that could somehow control the light from a star, something that existed on a scale I couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, without any warning or final signal, the star went dark and didn't come back. Not just stopped blinking, it disappeared entirely. Where there had been a bright point of light among the stars of Cassiopeia, there was now empty space. I spent the rest of the night staring at that spot, hoping the star would reappear, but it never did. It hasn't returned since then, and it's been almost a year now. I still go up on the roof every clear night, scanning that part of the sky, watching for any sign of the mysterious star. I've learned more about astronomy in the past year than I ever thought I would, studying star charts and keeping detailed logs of everything I observe. But I've never seen anything like that blinking star again. I've shared the video footage with several astronomy professors at the local university, claiming I captured it while experimenting with night photography. They've offered various explanations: a satellite reflecting sunlight, an aircraft with unusual lighting, atmospheric effects that can make stars appear to flicker. But none of them can account for the deliberate patterns, the responses to my signals, or the fact that the star eventually disappeared entirely. Sometimes I wonder if I was chosen for that communication, if whatever intelligence was behind it specifically sought out someone who would be watching at the right time and place. Other times I think it was just random chance. I happened to be looking up when something vast and incomprehensible decided to announce its presence to our small corner of the universe. What haunts me most is the question of scale. If something could control the light from a star, if it could turn stellar radiation on and off like a light switch, what kind of technology would that require? What kind of intelligence would possess that capability? And if such beings exist, what were they trying to tell me during that brief exchange of signals? I still flash my LED light at the stars occasionally, usually when I'm feeling particularly lonely or when the silence of the night becomes overwhelming. I cycle through different patterns: SOS, simple counting sequences, even attempts at mathematical concepts that might be universal. But the stars remain stubbornly normal, burning with their ancient light, showing no sign that anyone is listening. Except sometimes, late at night when my eyes are tired and my imagination is running wild, I think I see subtle variations in starlight that might be responses to my signals. A star that seems to pulse just slightly out of rhythm with atmospheric turbulence. A brief dimming that lasts exactly the right amount of time to be intentional. But I can never be sure if I'm seeing real communication or just the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. The experience changed my relationship with the night sky permanently. I can no longer look up at the stars without wondering which ones might be listening, which ones might be watching, which ones might suddenly decide to blink back. The universe feels less empty now, but also more mysterious, filled with intelligences operating on scales so vast that our entire solar system might be nothing more than a minor detail in their cosmic perspective. I keep watching, though. Every clear night, I'm up on that roof, scanning the sky for any sign that I'm not alone in my observations, because once you've seen a star deliberately blink at you, once you've engaged in conversation with something that can manipulate the light of distant suns, you never stop hoping it might happen again. The trail we were following wasn't on any official map. My hiking partner, Jake, had found it mentioned in a forum post from someone who claimed to have discovered abandoned infrastructure from the Cold War era, hidden deep in the Olympic National Forest. As amateur radio enthusiasts, we were both fascinated by the idea of finding old transmission equipment, so we'd planned a 3-day backpacking trip to search for whatever might be out there. The trailhead was about 40 miles west of Port Angeles, at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. We'd driven as far as we could in Jake's pickup truck, then loaded our packs and started hiking into terrain that felt increasingly remote with every mile. The forest was thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock, and the understory was dense enough that we could barely see 50 feet in any direction. We'd been hiking for about 6 hours when we found the first sign that we were on the right track, a concrete foundation overgrown with moss and ferns, barely visible beneath decades of forest debris. It was too large and too perfectly square to be natural, clearly the remnant of some kind of structure that had been built and then abandoned years ago. Jake and I spent 20 minutes clearing away the vegetation, revealing what looked like anchor points for guy wires and the remains of a grounding system. Definitely radio equipment, Jake said, examining the corroded metal fittings embedded in the concrete. Big stuff, too. We followed a barely visible path leading away from the foundation, marked by the occasional piece of rusted cable or ceramic insulator hanging from tree branches. The trail wound uphill through increasingly steep terrain, and after another 2 hours of climbing, we reached a ridge that offered our first clear view of the surrounding landscape. That's when we saw the tower. It was about half a mile away, rising from a small clearing on an adjacent ridge. From our vantage point, it looked like a standard radio tower, maybe 200 feet tall, lattice construction, with what appeared to be several antenna arrays mounted at different levels. What struck us immediately was how well maintained it looked. The metal appeared to be in good condition, with no obvious rust or structural damage, and the guy wires were taut and properly tensioned. That's strange, I said, studying the tower through binoculars. Jake was checking his GPS unit, trying to correlate our position with the topographic maps we'd brought. According to this, there's nothing here. No roads, no structures, nothing. We decided to make camp where we were and approach the tower in the morning when we'd have better light and more energy. As we set up our tents, we could see a faint red light blinking at the top of the tower, the standard aircraft warning beacon that all tall structures are required to have. The fact that it was operating suggested that the tower was still active, still connected to some kind of power source. After dinner, Jake pulled out his portable radio scanner and started cycling through frequencies, listening for any transmissions that might be coming from the tower. For the first hour, we heard nothing but the usual mix of commercial broadcasts, aviation communications, and amateur radio chatter. But around 10 o'clock, Jake stopped scanning and held up his hand for silence. Listen to this, he said, adjusting the volume. The signal was strong and clear, coming from somewhere in the high frequency range. It was a human voice, male, middle-aged, speaking in a calm, measured tone that suggested he was reading from prepared text. But the content of the transmission was unlike anything either of us had heard before. Temperature readings remained stable at -7 degrees Celsius, 92 inches, and falling slowly. Wind speed is 8 knots from the northwest. Solar radiation levels are within normal parameters. Time is 20 to 200 hours, Pacific Standard Time. The voice stopped, and the frequency went silent. Jake and I looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. Weather reports, I said. Jake added, this frequency isn't monitored by the National Weather Service. It's not on any of the standard emergency bands. We stayed up until midnight, listening for the next transmission. At exactly 11 p.m., the same voice returned with another weather report, delivered in the same calm, professional tone. The data was precise and detailed, covering atmospheric conditions, temperature variations at different altitudes, and solar activity levels. It sounded like the kind of information you might hear from a research station in Antarctica or a remote military installation. The next morning, we broke camp early and hiked toward the tower. The terrain was more difficult than it had appeared from a distance, and it took us 3 hours to cover the half-mile of ridges and valleys that separated us from our destination. When we finally reached the clearing where the tower stood, we found something that didn't match what we'd observed from afar. The tower itself was exactly as it had appeared through binoculars, tall, well-maintained, and obviously functional. But the support buildings at its base were in a state of decay that suggested they'd been abandoned for decades. There were 3 concrete block structures arranged around the base of the tower, all with their roofs partially collapsed and their walls crumbling from years of exposure to the elements. Jake and I approached the buildings cautiously, unsure whether we might encounter security systems or caretakers. But the place felt deserted, with that particular quality of emptiness that comes with long abandonment. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and the doorways were blocked by debris that had accumulated over many seasons. The largest building appeared to have housed the main transmitting equipment. Through a broken window, we could see racks of electronic gear covered in dust and debris, their metal cases corroded and their connections long since failed. It was clearly non-functional, the kind of vintage equipment that might have been state-of-the-art in the 1960s, but had been obsolete for decades. But the tower itself was definitely active. We could hear a faint humming sound coming from the base, where heavy cables disappeared into a concrete vault that was sealed with a steel cover we couldn't remove. Every hour, we could hear the click of relays engaging, followed by the brief burst of radio transmission that we'd been monitoring the night before. Jake wondered aloud. There are no electrical lines out here, no generators that I can see. We spent the rest of the day exploring the area around the tower, looking for clues about its purpose and operation. We found the remains of what might have been living quarters, a small building that had once contained bunks and a kitchen. There was also a structure that looked like it had been used for vehicle maintenance, with a concrete floor stained by decades-old oil spills. Most intriguingly, we discovered a partially buried cable that led away from the tower site toward the deeper forest. The cable was modern, much newer than the abandoned buildings, and it disappeared into a conduit that had been carefully camouflaged with natural materials. Jake and I followed it for about a quarter mile before losing the trail in dense underbrush. That evening, we camped in the clearing next to the tower, listening to the hourly weather broadcasts and trying to piece together what we'd found. The transmissions continued like clockwork, precise, professional, and utterly pointless as far as we could determine. No one responded to the broadcasts, no other stations acknowledged them, and the frequency remained silent except for those brief, hourly reports. Around midnight, something changed. Instead of the usual weather data, the voice began transmitting what sounded like a series of numbers and letters, coordinates, radio frequencies, and coded references that meant nothing to us. The transmission lasted for nearly 10 minutes, much longer than the usual weather reports, and it was followed by a period of silence that stretched past the normal 1-hour interval. When the voice returned, it was different. The tone was more urgent, less controlled, and the content had shifted from scientific data to what sounded like personal observations. Day 847 of the monitoring protocol, the voice said. No contact from base station in 72 hours. Equipment is functioning within normal parameters, but I'm beginning to question the purpose of continued transmission. 230 megahertz. Jake and I exchanged glances. This wasn't a recording or an automated system. It was a live person, broadcasting from somewhere nearby, apparently unaware that anyone was listening. But where was he? We'd explored the entire area around the tower, and there was no evidence of current human habitation. The next morning, we made a more systematic search of the area, looking for any structure we might have missed. About a quarter mile from the tower, following the buried cable we'd discovered, we found something that shouldn't have been there, a small building that hadn't been visible from any of our previous vantage points. It was built into the side of a hill and covered with vegetation so that it blended perfectly with the natural landscape. The building had a single steel door with no windows, and it was clearly much newer than the abandoned structures around the tower. When we approached it, we could hear the faint sound of electrical equipment running inside. Ventilation fans, maybe computers, the subtle hum of modern electronics. Jake knocked on the door, and the sounds inside immediately stopped. We waited for several minutes, but no one answered. When Jake knocked again, a voice called out from inside, the same voice we'd been hearing on the radio. The voice asked, "This is a restricted facility." "We're hikers," Jake called back. "We got lost and we're just trying to find our way back to the trail." There was a long pause before the voice responded. "That's impossible. No one comes out here." "We hiked in from the logging road about 10 miles east of here," I said. "We're amateur radio operators, and we were interested in the old tower." Another long pause. Then we heard the sound of multiple locks being disengaged, and the door opened just wide enough to reveal a man in his 50s with a graying beard and clothing that looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. His eyes were wide and slightly unfocused, like someone who hadn't seen another human being in a very long time. "You can't be here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is a classified monitoring station," Jake asked gently. The man's expression became confused, almost lost. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I've been sending the same data for over 2 years now. temperature, pressure, atmospheric conditions. But no one ever responds. No one ever acknowledges the transmissions. He told us his name was Dr. Richard Morse, and that he was a meteorologist who had been assigned to this remote station as part of what he'd been told was a long-term atmospheric research project. He'd been living alone in the underground facility, following protocols that required him to broadcast weather data every hour and to maintain strict communication security. But it's been 2 years, he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 2 years of the same routine, and I haven't had any contact with my supervisors since the first month. The supply drops stopped coming. The radio checks stopped happening. Jake and I spent the next hour talking with Dr. Morse, trying to understand his situation. It became clear that he was in serious psychological distress, isolated for so long that he'd begun to lose track of time and purpose. He showed us his living quarters, a small, cramped space filled with monitoring equipment and supplies that were clearly running low. We convinced him to come with us when we hiked out, promising to help him contact his superiors and get the answers he deserved. But when we reached the trailhead and Dr. Morse tried to call the phone numbers he'd been given, every one of them was disconnected. The organization that had stationed him at the tower seemed to have vanished, leaving him to continue his pointless broadcasts to an empty sky. It took weeks of investigation, but we eventually learned that Dr. Morse had been the victim of an elaborate psychological experiment conducted by a private research company that had since been dissolved and its principals thus scattered to other ventures. He'd been told he was participating in legitimate atmospheric research, but in reality, he was being studied to determine how long an isolated individual could maintain routine tasks without external validation or contact. Dr. Morse is doing better now. He's receiving treatment for the psychological trauma of his isolation, and he's found work with a legitimate weather monitoring organization. But sometimes, when I'm scanning the radio frequencies late at night, I think about that tower standing alone in the Olympic forest, still broadcasting its hourly weather reports to no one, still following protocols that were designed not to gather data, but to study the limits of human endurance. The experience changed how I think about the remote places in our world, the forgotten installations and abandoned projects that dot the landscape like scars from experiments we'd rather not remember. How many other Dr. Morses are out there, following orders that no longer have meaning, broadcasting to audiences that no longer exist, waiting for contact that will never come? The tower is still there, is still active. Jake and I reported its location to the authorities, but bureaucratic inertia means it will probably keep transmitting for years before anyone bothers to shut it down. And somewhere in the static between the stations, Dr. Morse's voice still echoes, reading weather data to the empty air, a ghost frequency carrying the message of a man who was forgotten by the people who sent him into the wilderness to wait. I installed the security camera after my neighbor's cabin was broken into last summer. It seemed like common sense. I spend most weekends at my place, up in the Adirondacks, but during the week it sits empty, and there had been a string of break-ins throughout the region. The camera was nothing fancy, just a wireless model that sent alerts to my phone and stored footage in the cloud. I mounted it under the eaves above my front door, angled to capture anyone approaching the cabin. The property is about 2 hours north of Albany, 15 acres of mixed forest, with a small log cabin that my grandfather built in the 1960s. It's accessed by a quarter-mile dirt road that branches off from a county highway, and my nearest neighbor is almost a mile away through thick woods. During the week, especially in winter, it's about as isolated as you can get in upstate New York. I'd had the camera for about 3 months when I got the alert that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late February, and I was at my apartment in the city, settling in to watch a movie after a long day at work. My phone chimed with a motion detection notification from the cabin camera. I almost ignored it. I got false alarms fairly regularly from deer wandering through the yard or branches swaying in the wind. But something made me open the app and check the live feed. The image showed the familiar view of my front porch and the snow-covered yard beyond, illuminated by the camera's infrared LEDs. Everything looked normal, exactly as I'd left it the previous Sunday when I'd driven back to the city. I was about to close the app when I noticed the timestamp on the recorded event that had triggered the alert. The motion had been detected at exactly 3:33 a.m., and the recording was 12 minutes long. 12 minutes of sustained motion detection was unusual. Most of my false alarms lasted only a few seconds, as whatever had triggered the sensor moved out of frame. I clicked on the recording and settled back to watch what I assumed would be footage of a deer or maybe a raccoon investigating my porch. The first few minutes showed nothing but the empty yard and the dark windows of the cabin. The infrared imaging gave everything a ghostly, black and white appearance, but I'd grown accustomed to that from checking the camera periodically. Then, at about the 4-minute mark, a figure walked into frame from the left side of the screen. At first glance, it looked like a person. The figure was tall and moved upright on 2 legs, approaching the cabin from the directions of the tree line. But as I watched more carefully, I realized something was wrong with the proportions. The figure was too tall, maybe 7 feet or more, and its limbs seemed unusually long. It moved with an odd, gliding gait that didn't quite match normal human locomotion. The figure approached my front door and stopped directly in front of it, maybe 3 feet from the camera. This should have given me a clear view of whatever it was, but instead, the image became strangely unclear. The infrared illumination seemed to scatter or diffuse around the figure, creating a halo effect that obscured details. I could make out the general outline: tall, thin, humanoid, but facial features, clothing, even specific body details were lost in a kind of visual static. What disturbed me most was how still it stood. For the remaining 8 minutes of the recording, the figure didn't move at all. It simply stood there facing my door, motionless as a statue. There was something profoundly unnatural about that stillness. No shifting weight, no minor adjustments of posture, none of the unconscious movements that even the most disciplined person would make while standing in one place for that long. At the end of the 12-minute recording, the figure simply walked away, moving back toward the tree line with the same gliding motion it had arrived with. It disappeared from frame, and the motion detection stopped. I immediately checked the live feed, but the yard was empty again, showing no sign that anything had been there. I watched the recording 3 more times that night, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Maybe it was a very tall person in heavy winter clothing. Maybe the infrared imaging was creating visual artifacts. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. But none of those explanations felt adequate. The figure's proportions were wrong, its behavior was wrong, and the way the camera seemed unable to capture clear details of it suggested something beyond normal technical limitations. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that tall, still figure standing at my door, waiting for something I couldn't understand. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and reported a possible trespasser. I didn't mention the unusual aspects of the recording. I just said my security camera had captured someone on my property, and I was concerned about potential break-ins. Deputy Martinez was sympathetic, but not particularly surprised. He told me that isolated properties often attracted transients, especially during winter when people were looking for shelter. He said he'd have a patrol car drive by when possible, but with the cabin being so remote, regular patrols weren't practical. He suggested I consider additional security measures and promised to keep my report on file. I drove up to the cabin that weekend, partly to check on the property and partly because I needed to see the place where the recording had been made. Everything looked normal in daylight. No footprints in the snow, no signs of disturbance around the door or windows. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any indication that someone had been there, but the snow was unmarked except for animal tracks. I checked the camera's position and settings, wondering if there might be some technical explanation for the strange visual effects in the recording. But the camera was securely mounted and functioning normally. I even tested it by walking in front of it myself, and the infrared imaging captured my movements with perfect clarity. Whatever had caused the distortion around the figure in the recording, it wasn't a camera malfunction. That night, I stayed at the cabin with every light on and my grandfather's old hunting rifle within easy reach. I monitored the camera feed constantly on my phone, jumping at every shadow that moved across the screen. But the night passed quietly, and nothing appeared except a few deer browsing near the tree line around midnight. I thought that might be the end of it. Strange as the recording was, it was just one isolated incident, and there were probably rational explanations I hadn't considered. But 2 weeks later, I got another alert. This time, the motion detection triggered at 3:33 a.m. exactly, the same time as before. The recording was 12 minutes long, just like the first one, and when I opened the file, I saw the same tall figure approaching from the same direction, walking with that same unnatural glide, stopping in the same spot directly in front of my door. The visual distortion was even more pronounced in this second recording. The figure seemed to flicker and shift, as if the camera was having difficulty focusing on it. Sometimes it appeared solid and definite, sometimes it seemed translucent, almost ghostly. But throughout the 12 minutes, it maintained that same perfectly motionless stance, facing my door as if waiting for something. This pattern continued for the next 6 weeks. Every 2 weeks, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the motion detector would trigger. Every time, the recording would be exactly 12 minutes long. Every time, the same figure would appear, approach the door, stand motionless, and then walk away. The consistency was both fascinating and terrifying. Whatever this thing was, it was operating on a schedule, following some kind of routine that I couldn't begin to understand. I started researching everything I could find about unexplained sightings in the Adirondacks. The region has a long history of strange encounters, stories of unusual creatures in the deep woods, reports of figures that don't quite look human, tales passed down by loggers and hunters, and old-timers who've spent their lives in the mountains. Most of it was folklore and local legend, but the consistency of certain details across different accounts was unsettling. I also began to notice changes in my own behavior. I found myself obsessing over the camera feed, checking it constantly throughout the day and night. I stopped sleeping well, even when I was in the city, because I was always expecting another alert. The cabin, which had been my refuge from urban stress, became a source of anxiety that I couldn't escape. The seventh recording was different. The figure appeared at the usual time and followed its usual routine, but when it reached the door, it turned to look directly at the camera. For the first time, I could see its face clearly through the infrared imaging, and what I saw made me understand that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The features were recognizably humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways that triggered every instinctual alarm I possessed. The eyes were too large and too dark, reflecting the infrared light with an intensity that created bright spots on the recording. The proportions of the face were stretched and elongated, as if someone had taken human features and pulled them in directions they weren't meant to go. And when it looked at the camera, I had the unmistakable impression that it could see me watching it, that it was aware of my observation despite the hundreds of miles between us. It stood there for the full 12 minutes, staring directly into the camera lens, before turning and walking away as it always did. But this time, just before it disappeared from frame, it raised one impossibly long arm and appeared to wave goodbye. I never went back to the cabin after that. I put the property up for sale the following week, taking a significant loss just to be rid of it. The real estate agent asked why I was selling such a beautiful and peaceful retreat, and I told him I'd lost interest in camping. I never mentioned the recordings or the thing that visited my door every 2 weeks with clockwork precision. The new owners are a young couple from Massachusetts who wanted an escape from city life. I hope they're happy there. I hope they never install a security camera, and I hope that whatever was visiting my cabin was tied to me personally rather than to the place itself, because the thought of that tall, patient figure standing at their door in the small hours of the morning is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. I still have all the recordings saved on my phone. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself watching them again, trying to understand what that thing wanted from me. It never tried to break in, never caused any damage, never showed any signs of hostility. It just stood there, waiting, as if it knew something I didn't, as if it was giving me time to figure out something important. But I never did figure it out, and now I never will. I live in a downtown apartment now, surrounded by neighbors and city lights and the constant hum of urban life. I tell myself I'm safer here, but sometimes, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I wake up with the feeling that something is standing just outside my door, patient and still and impossibly tall, waiting for me to understand what it's trying to tell me. The first thing you learn working maintenance on remote installations is that when something goes wrong, you're on your own. Help is hours away at best, and that's assuming you can get a message out. The second thing you learn is that some problems can't be fixed with tools and spare parts. I learned that lesson on a December night in 2020, working the graveyard shift at Station Echo 7, a radar installation so far north in Alaska that the sun doesn't rise for 2 months out of the year. Echo 7 sits on a ridge about 180 miles northeast of Fairbanks, part of a network of early warning systems that scan the Arctic sky for aircraft that aren't supposed to be there. It's not the kind of place they put on tourist maps, just a cluster of prefab buildings, a massive radar dish, and enough diesel generators to keep everything running through the long polar night. The nearest town is a 4-hour drive on a road that's more of a suggestion than an actual route, and during winter storms, that drive can take 8 hours or kill you, depending on your luck. I'd been working Echo 7 for about 6 months when it happened, long enough to get used to the isolation, but not long enough to stop feeling uneasy about it. The station was normally staffed by 4 people, 2 radar operators, a communications specialist, and me. But that week, Peterson was on medical leave after breaking his leg in a snowmobile accident, and Williams had been called back to Elmendorf for some kind of training. That left just me and Kowalski to keep the station running, which wasn't unusual but wasn't ideal either. Kowalski was a good operator, 15 years in the Air Force before taking the civilian contractor position. Steady, professional, the kind of guy who could track a dozen aircraft simultaneously while carrying on a conversation about baseball. We worked well together during the long nights, him monitoring the scope while I made rounds, checking generators, and maintaining the equipment that kept us connected to the world. The trouble started around midnight on a Tuesday. I was in the generator shed, running routine maintenance on the backup diesel when the lights flickered. Not unusual, the power grid up there is constantly balancing loads, and brief fluctuations are part of life. But these flickers had a pattern to them, a rhythm that seemed too regular to be accidental. 3 short flickers, 3 long ones, 3 short again, over and over. I finished with the generator and walked back to the operations building, where Kowalski was hunched over his radar console, adjusting settings with the kind of careful attention that meant something was wrong. "Getting some interference," he said without looking up. "Started about 10 minutes ago." I looked at his scope over his shoulder. The display showed the familiar green sweep line rotating around the circle, but instead of the usual clean background with occasional blips for aircraft, the screen was filled with a strange pattern. It looked almost like static, but it was organized, moving in waves that seemed to pulse in sync with the light flickers I'd noticed in the generator shed. "Could be atmospheric," I suggested. Kowalski shook his head. "Aurora interference is random. This is too regular, too structured." He tried adjusting the filters, changing frequencies, recalibrating the system. Nothing helped. If anything, the pattern seemed to be getting stronger, more defined. After an hour of troubleshooting, we decided to call it into headquarters. That's when we discovered our communications were down. The radio produced nothing but static. The satellite uplink showed a connection error. Even the landline phone, which ran through a buried cable all the way back to the highway, was dead. We were completely cut off, with no way to report our status or request assistance. Storm probably took out a relay tower, Kowalski said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The weather had been clear for 3 days, with no wind to speak of. There was no reason for multiple communication systems to fail simultaneously. I went outside to check the satellite dish and the radio antenna, thinking maybe ice buildup was causing problems. The night was crystal clear, so cold that the air seemed to crackle with each breath. The aurora was active, sheets of green and blue light dancing across the star-filled sky in patterns that were almost hypnotic to watch. But as I stood there looking up at the lights, I noticed something that made me forget about the cold. The aurora wasn't behaving the way it usually did. Instead of the random flowing patterns I was used to seeing, it was moving in the same rhythm as the interference on our radar screen. Pulses of light swept across the sky in organized waves, too regular to be natural, too coordinated to be coincidental. I called Kowalski outside to see it. We stood together in the sub-zero air, watching the sky perform what looked like a deliberate light show. The patterns were beautiful, but deeply unsettling, like watching a familiar friend suddenly speak in a language you'd never heard before. "That's not normal," Kowalski said quietly. We went back inside and tried everything we could think of to restore communications. We checked every connection, replaced cables, even tried running the radio off battery power in case there was some kind of electrical interference from the generators. Nothing worked. We were alone on that ridge, surrounded by thousands of square miles of Arctic wilderness, with no way to tell anyone what was happening. Around 3 in the morning, the radar interference suddenly stopped. The screen cleared, showing the normal empty sweep we expected to see in that remote area. Our communications came back online all at once. Radio, satellite, even the landline phone started working again. It was as if someone had thrown a switch and returned everything to normal. Kowalski immediately tried to contact headquarters, but before he could key the microphone, we both heard something that made us freeze. There was a sound coming from outside, low and rhythmic, like a massive machine operating somewhere in the distance. It was too regular to be wind, too deep to be any aircraft we knew about. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, Kowalski close behind me. The sound was coming from the north, beyond the ridge where our radar dish was mounted. We climbed up to the antenna platform, our boots crunching in the snow, and looked out across the valley below. What we saw there still gives me chills when I think about it. There were lights in the valley, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern about a mile from our position. Not the warm yellow glow of buildings or vehicles, but a cold blue-white illumination that seemed to come from sources positioned at regular intervals across the landscape. The lights formed a grid, maybe half a mile on each side, with each point of light pulsing in the same rhythm we'd been seeing on our radar screen. The sound was coming from the center of this grid, a deep thrumming that we could feel as much as hear. As we watched, the lights began to move, rotating slowly around the central point, like a massive clock face. The movement was smooth and deliberate, clearly controlled by some kind of intelligence. "We need to report this," Kowalski whispered. But when we went back inside and tried to use the radio, we discovered that our communications were down again. The interference had returned to the radar screen, stronger than before. It was as if whatever was in the valley was responding to our attempts to contact the outside world, jamming our signals whenever we tried to call for help. For the next 3 hours, we took turns watching the lights through binoculars and trying to get some kind of message out. The pattern in the valley continued its slow rotation, and occasionally we could see what looked like smaller lights moving between the fixed points, like vehicles or aircraft following predetermined routes. The whole display had the organized, purposeful quality of a military operation, but unlike any military technology either of us had ever seen. Around 6 in the morning, just as the first hint of gray was beginning to show on the southern horizon, everything stopped. The lights in the valley went out all at once. The thrumming sound faded away, and our communications came back online as if nothing had ever been wrong. Kowalski and I looked at each other, both of us knowing that we faced an impossible choice. We could report what we'd seen and probably be relieved of duty for psychological evaluation, or we could say nothing and keep our jobs, but live with the knowledge that something extraordinary had happened and we'd been too afraid to speak up. We decided to compromise. Kowalski filed a routine maintenance report, noting brief communication outages and minor radar interference, attributing them to possible aurora activity. I filed my own report documenting power fluctuations and equipment checks, mentioning nothing about lights in the valley or impossible sounds in the night. When the day shift arrived that afternoon, they found everything operating normally. The radar was clean, communications were solid, all equipment was functioning within normal parameters. There was no evidence that anything unusual had happened during our watch. But 2 weeks later, Kowalski requested a transfer to a different installation. He never told me why, but I suspect he was having the same kind of dreams I was, vivid, recurring nightmares about being watched from the darkness, about signals coming from somewhere that shouldn't exist, about lights in the sky that formed patterns too complex and deliberate to be natural. I finished out my contract at Echo 7 3 months later and took a job with a civilian contractor working on radar installations in the lower 48. I've never been back to Alaska, and I've never worked another isolated posting. These days, I stick to installations where there are plenty of people around, where help is never more than a phone call away, where the night sky behaves the way it's supposed to. But I still think about that December night, about the lights in the valley and the sound that came from nowhere. I've spent hours researching military exercises, experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, anything that might explain what Kowalski and I witnessed. I've never found a satisfactory answer. What haunts me most is the intelligence behind it all. The coordinated timing, the response to our communication attempts, the geometric precision of the light patterns. None of it felt random or natural. Something was operating in that valley, something that was aware of our presence and capable of interfering with our equipment when we tried to report it. I keep telling myself that there's a rational explanation, that someday I'll read about a declassified military program or a scientific experiment that will make sense of what we saw. But deep down, I know that's not true. What we encountered that night was something that exists outside the boundaries of our official knowledge, something that operates in the spaces between what we acknowledge and what we're willing to accept. The Arctic is a big place, full of empty ridges and isolated valleys where anything could be happening without anyone knowing about it. And somewhere out there, in the long polar night, lights are still forming patterns in the darkness, sending signals that no one is supposed to intercept, carrying on operations that no one is supposed to witness. I just hope they're content to remain hidden, and that whatever they're doing up there, they never decide they need to do it somewhere else. I used to think I understood the difference between dreaming and being awake. That certainty ended on a clear August night in 2021 when I closed my eyes in my sleeping bag on a familiar mountain ridge and opened them somewhere that shouldn't exist. I'd been backpacking alone in the Cascade Range, following a trail I'd hiked dozens of times before. It was a 3-day solo trip, the kind I took whenever the stress of my job as a software engineer in Seattle became too much to handle. The trail led to a series of alpine lakes tucked between granite peaks, places where you could sit for hours without seeing another human being. On the second night, I'd made camp on a small plateau about a mile above Mirror Lake, at an elevation where the trees gave way to open meadows and scattered boulders. It was one of those perfect late summer evenings when the air is still warm despite the altitude, and the sky is so clear that the stars seem close enough to touch. I'd eaten dinner, hung my food properly to keep it away from bears, and laid out my sleeping bag on a flat patch of granite still warm from the day's sun. I remember lying on my back, looking up at the Milky Way stretched across the darkness above me. The city lights of Seattle were too far away to cause any light pollution up there, and I could see more stars than most people ever get to witness. I was thinking about constellations, trying to trace the patterns my father had taught me when I was a child, when sleep took me gradually and peacefully. I've always been a light sleeper when camping, allured to every sound that might indicate wildlife moving through the area. So when I woke up, it was with the immediate awareness that something was different. The air felt warmer and more humid than it should have at that elevation. The quality of light was wrong too. Instead of the gray pre-dawn glow I expected, everything was bathed in a soft, golden illumination that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I sat up in my sleeping bag and looked around, expecting to see the familiar granite outcroppings and scattered alpine firs that marked the plateau where I'd made camp. Instead, I found myself in what looked like a vast meadow filled with flowers I didn't recognize. The grass was softer and greener than anything that grows at high altitude, and it was dotted with blooms and colors that seemed too vivid, too saturated to be entirely natural. The sky above me was the deep blue of early evening rather than dawn, filled with stars that were brighter and more numerous than any I'd ever seen. But these weren't the constellations I knew. The patterns were different, alien, as if I were looking at the night sky from some other planet or some other time entirely. I stood up slowly, my sleeping bag falling away, and turned in a complete circle. In every direction, the meadow stretched to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. There were no mountains, no trees, no landmarks of any kind, just endless grass and flowers under that strange, star-filled sky. The golden light that illuminated everything had no visible source. There was no sun, no moon, nothing that could account for the gentle radiance that made it possible to see clearly, despite the apparent darkness above. My first thought was that I was dreaming, but everything felt too real, too consistent. The grass was cool and slightly damp under my bare feet. I could smell the flowers, a complex fragrance that was sweet but not cloying, unlike any perfume I'd ever encountered. When I reached down to touch one of the blooms, it felt solid and real, with petals that had the proper texture and weight of living tissue. I called out, my voice carrying clearly in the still air, but there was no echo, no response except the profound silence that surrounded me. The absence of sound was complete. No wind, no insects, no distant water or rustling leaves. It was as if I had been placed in a world that existed outside the normal flow of time and noise. I started walking, picking a direction at random and moving through the meadow with the deliberate pace of someone who has no idea where they're going, but feels compelled to move nonetheless. The grass parted easily before my feet, and the flowers released their fragrance as I brushed past them. Everything felt real and substantial, yet there was a dreamlike quality to the way colors seemed to shift and change in my peripheral vision, the way distances seemed to compress and expand as I walked. After what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, I came to a small stream running through the meadow. The water was perfectly clear and cold when I knelt to drink from it, tasting of nothing but pure, clean water. I followed the stream for a while, grateful to have something that resembled a path through the uniformity of the endless grass. The stream led to a grove of trees unlike any I'd ever seen. They were tall and graceful, with bark that seemed to shimmer in the golden light and leaves that moved in a breeze I couldn't feel. As I approached them, I realized they were making a sound, not quite music, but a soft harmonic humming that rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like conversation. I stood at the edge of the grove for a long time, listening to that strange song and trying to decide whether to enter. There was something welcoming about the trees, something that invited exploration, but there was also a sense that crossing into the grove would be a more significant step than simply walking through the meadow. It would be a choice, a commitment to whatever this experience was. I was still standing there, weighing my options, when I noticed movement among the trees. Figures were moving in the shadows beneath the canopy, tall and graceful like the trees themselves. They seemed to be aware of me, but they made no move to approach or retreat. They simply continued their slow, purposeful movement through the grove, occasionally pausing to touch the bark of a tree or to gather something from the ground. One of them eventually emerged from the shadows and walked toward me. As it came closer, I could see that it was humanoid, but clearly not human. It was taller than any person, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in ways that suggested a different underlying anatomy. Its skin had a pale, luminescent quality that made it seem like a source of light rather than something that merely reflected it. When it reached the edge of the grove, it stopped and looked at me with eyes that were large and dark and filled with what I can only describe as kindness. It didn't speak, but somehow I understood that it was offering me a choice. I could enter the grove and continue deeper into whatever this world was, or I could return to where I came from. The decision was mine, but once made, it would be final. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, torn between curiosity and fear. Part of me wanted desperately to follow this being into the grove, to explore this impossible world and learn its secrets. But another part of me, the part that was still connected to my ordinary life, urged caution. I thought about my job, my apartment, my friends and family, all the mundane but important connections that anchored me to the world I knew. In the end, I chose to go back. I don't know if it was wisdom or cowardice, but something told me I wasn't ready for whatever lay deeper in that strange landscape. I nodded to the being, hoping it would understand my decision, and turned away from the grove. The journey back through the meadow felt different, more urgent somehow. The golden light began to fade as I walked, and the vivid colors of the flowers gradually muted to more natural tones. The impossible horizon drew closer, and familiar shapes began to emerge from the uniformity. Rocky outcroppings, scattered trees, the silhouette of mountains against the sky. When I reached my sleeping bag, it was exactly where I had left it, on the granite plateau above Mirror Lake. But the world around it was my world again, the sparse vegetation and rocky terrain of the high Cascades, the familiar constellations overhead, the cool, thin air of altitude. I lay down and pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin, shivering slightly in the mountain cold. I watched the sky gradually lighten toward dawn, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I been sleepwalking? Had it all been an unusually vivid dream? But my feet were damp with dew from the strange grass, and I could still smell the fragrance of those impossible flowers on my clothes. I packed up camp as soon as there was enough light to see clearly, and hiked out to the trailhead in record time. I spent the drive back to Seattle trying to convince myself that it had all been some kind of sleep-induced hallucination brought on by altitude and exhaustion and too much time alone in the wilderness. But I couldn't shake the memory of that choice I'd been offered, the sense that I had been standing at the threshold of something vast and transformative. I kept thinking about the being with the kind eyes, wondering if it was still waiting at the edge of that grove, ready to guide other travelers who found themselves in that golden meadow. It's been 3 years since that night, and I've never experienced anything like it again. I still go backpacking, still sleep under the stars, but I'm always careful to camp in familiar places, surrounded by landmarks I can recognize when I wake up. Part of me hopes for another glimpse of that other world, but a larger part is grateful that I made it back to this one. Sometimes, late at night when sleep is slow to come, I wonder about the path I didn't take. What would have happened if I had followed that luminescent being into the grove? What secrets might I have learned? What wonders might I have witnessed? But then I think about my life here, imperfect but real, and I'm reminded that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some thresholds uncrossed. The experience left me with a permanent sense that reality is far stranger and more permeable than we usually imagine. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of sleep and the familiar boundaries of our mapped world, there are places where different rules apply, where the impossible becomes routine and kindness wears forms we don't recognize. I was given a glimpse of such a place, and the memory of it has changed the way I see everything else. I still look up at the stars when I'm camping, but now I wonder what they're looking down on, what other worlds might be tucked between the spaces we think we understand. And sometimes, when the night is particularly clear and I'm far enough from the city lights, I think I can almost see that golden glow on the horizon, that soft illumination that marks the boundary between what we know and what we can only dream of knowing. The metal detector was supposed to be a retirement hobby, something to get me outside and maybe find a few interesting coins or pieces of old jewelry. I'd bought it 3 months after I finished my last day teaching high school chemistry, thinking it would give me a reason to explore the countryside around our house in rural Oregon. What I found in my own backyard wasn't what I was looking for, and it's changed the way I think about what might be hidden just beneath the surface of our everyday world. Our house sits on 5 acres, about 10 miles outside of Corvallis, on land that my wife Janet and I bought 20 years ago when we were still young enough to think we'd eventually build a bigger place. We never did build that bigger house, but we'd grown attached to the quiet and the space, the way you could step outside at night and actually see the Milky Way. The property is mostly open field with a few stands of Douglas fir, and we never done much with the backyard except mow it and plant a small vegetable garden near the house. It was a Saturday morning in late March when I decided to try out the metal detector in our own yard before venturing out to public parks or beaches. The ground was still soft from the spring rains, and I figured it would be good practice to learn how the machine worked on familiar terrain. Janet was inside reading, and I had the whole morning to myself to figure out the various settings and sensitivity levels. I started near the house, working in a systematic grid pattern like I'd read about in the instruction manual. For the first hour, I found the usual suburban detritus, a few bottle caps, some aluminum can pull tabs, a handful of corroded nails that were probably from construction work we'd had done over the years. The detector would beep. I'd dig a small hole, retrieve whatever piece of metal was buried there, and fill the hole back in. Around 10:30, I was working an area about 50 yards from the house, near the edge of what we optimistically called our orchard. 4 apple trees we'd planted years ago that never quite thrived in our clay soil. The detector gave a strong, clear signal, the kind that usually indicates something substantial rather than just a piece of trash. I marked the spot with a small flag and started digging. The object was about 18 inches down, buried deeper than anything else I'd found that morning. As I cleared the dirt away with my small shovel, I could see it was metallic and roughly cylindrical, maybe 8 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. But what struck me immediately was that it was warm to the touch, noticeably warmer than the cool spring soil surrounding it. I assumed at first that it must have been conducting heat from somewhere, maybe a buried utility line or some kind of geothermal effect. But as I carefully excavated around it, I could see that it was completely isolated, surrounded by the same clay soil that made up the rest of our yard. There were no cables, no pipes, nothing that could have been transferring heat to it. When I finally worked it free and lifted it out of the hole, I could feel the warmth through my work gloves. The object was smooth and seamless, made of what looked like stainless steel or some similar alloy, with no visible joints, welds, or manufacturing marks. It was heavier than I expected, probably 6 or 7 pounds, and it had a subtle geometric pattern etched into its surface. Not decorative exactly, but purposeful, like it meant something. One end of the cylinder was flat, while the other had a gentle dome shape. The entire surface was mirror smooth, except for the etched patterns, which formed interconnected lines and angles that seemed to flow around the circumference in a way that was pleasing to look at, but impossible to follow completely. The metal felt warm and almost alive under my hands, as if there were some kind of energy source inside it. I sat in the grass next to the hole I'd dug, turning the object over in my hands and trying to make sense of what I'd found. It clearly wasn't a piece of ordinary household metal. The craftsmanship was too precise, the material too sophisticated, but it also didn't look like any kind of industrial component I was familiar with, and I'd seen plenty of those during my years teaching chemistry. What bothered me most was the heat. I held the object for nearly 20 minutes, and it never cooled down. If anything, it seemed to maintain a constant temperature that was maybe 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the ambient air. There was no vibration, no sound, no other indication of what might be generating that warmth, but it was definitely coming from inside the object itself. I took it into the house to show Janet. She was as puzzled as I was, though she was more focused on the practical questions. Where had it come from? How long had it been buried? Should we report it to someone? I was more fascinated by the technical aspects. What kind of metal stayed warm without any apparent power source? What were those patterns etched into the surface? We put it on the kitchen table and spent the next hour examining it more closely. Under good light, the patterns became more complex and detailed than they had appeared outside. They weren't random decorations. They had the look of technical diagrams, or perhaps some kind of script. The lines varied in depth and width, creating a texture that was subtle, but definitely intentional. Janet suggested we take it to the university, where someone in the materials science department might be able to identify the alloy or explain the heat generation. But something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that this object was meant to be private, that whatever it was, it had been hidden for a reason. Over the following days, I found myself spending more and more time studying the cylinder. I measured it carefully, photographed the patterns from every angle, and even tried making rubbings to capture the detail of the etchings. The heat never varied. It remained consistently warm, day and night, regardless of the ambient temperature. On the fourth day, I noticed that the patterns seemed to be slowly changing. It was subtle at first, just a sense that something was different when I looked at the object. But when I compared new photographs to the ones I'd taken earlier, I could see that some of the lines had definitely shifted position. Not dramatically, but enough to be measurable. The etched patterns were moving, rearranging themselves in slow motion across the surface of the cylinder. This discovery filled me with a mixture of excitement and unease. Whatever this object was, it was clearly more than just a piece of sophisticated metalwork. It was active, changing, responding to something in a way that defied my understanding of how metal objects should behave. I started keeping a daily photographic record, documenting the changes in the patterns. Over the course of 2 weeks, I watched as the etchings gradually rearranged themselves into new configurations. Sometimes the changes were geometric, creating different symmetries and relationships between the lines. Sometimes they seemed more organic, flowing like water or growing like roots. Janet grew increasingly concerned about my obsession with the object. She pointed out that I was spending hours every day staring at it. measuring it, photographing it. She worried about the unknown material it was made from, whether it might be radioactive or toxic. She urged me again to take it to experts who could analyze it properly, but I felt protective of it, almost possessive. This thing had been buried in my yard, waiting for me to find it. The slow dance of patterns across its surface felt like a form of communication, though I had no idea what it might be trying to tell me. I was convinced that if I studied it long enough, I would begin to understand its purpose. 3 weeks after I found it, the patterns stopped changing. They settled into a new configuration that was more complex than anything I'd seen before, an intricate mandala of interconnected lines that seemed to pulse with their own internal logic. The object remained warm, but it felt different somehow, more settled, as if it had reached some kind of completion. That night, I had a dream that was more vivid than any I'd ever experienced. I was standing in the same spot in our backyard where I'd found the cylinder, but the landscape was different. The grass was greener, the sky was a deeper blue, and there were structures in the distance that didn't belong to our world. Tall, graceful buildings that seemed to be made of the same material as the cylinder. In the dream, I wasn't alone. There were others there, beings that looked almost human, but not quite, watching me with expressions of patient kindness. One of them approached and held out their hand. Without speaking, I understood that they wanted the cylinder back. I gave it to them, and they nodded in acknowledgement before turning and walking away toward those impossible buildings. I woke up knowing that the object needed to be returned to where I'd found it. I went out to the backyard before sunrise, carrying the cylinder and a small shovel. The hole I'd filled in 3 weeks earlier was easy to locate, and I dug it out again, making it slightly deeper this time. I placed the cylinder carefully in the bottom of the hole, oriented exactly as I had found it. As I began to cover it with soil, I could swear I felt it pulse once, gently like a heartbeat. By the time Janet woke up, I had finished filling in the hole and smoothing the ground. I told her I had returned the object to where it belonged, and though she asked why, I couldn't give her an answer that made rational sense. I just knew it was the right thing to do. That was 6 months ago. I still use the metal detector occasionally, but I've never found anything else unusual. Sometimes I walk out to the spot where the cylinder is buried, and I think I can feel a faint warmth radiating up from the ground, though that might just be my imagination. I've thought a lot about what that object might have been, some kind of beacon, perhaps, or a message, or a piece of technology so advanced that it might as well be magic. I think about the dream and the beings who seem to be waiting for its return. I wonder if there are others like it, buried in backyards and fields around the world, waiting to be found by people who are curious enough to dig, but wise enough to eventually let go. The experience changed something in me. I look at the world differently now, more aware of the possibility that extraordinary things might be hidden in the most ordinary places. Our backyard looks the same as it always did, but I know that beneath the surface, just 18 inches down, something warm and mysterious waits in the darkness, keeping its own counsel about the nature of reality and our place within it. I found the drawings by accident last spring when I was cleaning out my mother's attic after she moved to assisted living. They were in a shoebox underneath a pile of old photo albums, mixed in with report cards and Mother's Day cards I'd made in elementary school. I almost threw the whole box away without looking through it, but something made me sit down on the dusty floor and sort through the contents one more time. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: crayon drawings of houses with triangle roofs and stick figure families, construction paper turkeys made by tracing my hand, the usual artifacts of childhood creativity. But there was one group of drawings that made me pause. They were all done in colored pencil, more detailed than my typical 6-year-old artwork, and they all depicted the same subject: a tall, thin figure standing among trees. I remembered drawing them, though I hadn't thought about them in decades. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, living in the house where my mother had raised me after my father left. It was a small ranch-style home on the outskirts of Millbrook, Vermont, backed up against several acres of mixed forest that stretched to the base of the Green Mountains. I spent most of my childhood in those woods, building forts and following deer trails, and generally treating the forest as my personal playground. But I also remembered being afraid of the woods sometimes, especially in the late afternoon when the shadows grew long and the light filtering through the leaves took on that golden, almost magical quality that makes familiar places seem suddenly foreign. I would tell my mother that there was someone in the woods, someone who watched me when I played outside. She would always ask who it was, and I would try to explain, but I never had adequate words for what I was seeing. So I drew instead. Looking at those drawings 30 years later, I was struck by their consistency. In every one, the figure was the same: impossibly tall and thin, with arms that hung down past its knees, and a face that was just a pale oval with no distinguishable features. It stood among the trees, like it belonged there, like it was as much a part of the forest as the oaks and maples that surrounded it. Sometimes I had drawn it partially hidden behind tree trunks, sometimes standing in small clearings, but always motionless, always watching. The strangest thing about the drawings was how well proportioned they were for a child's artwork. Usually, kids that age have trouble with scale and perspective, but these figures were drawn with a careful attention to size relationships that suggested I was trying very hard to get something exactly right. The figure was always drawn to be about 7 or 8 feet tall, towering over the trees in a way that looked anatomically possible but deeply unsettling. I took the drawings home with me, along with a few other childhood keepsakes, and stuck them in a folder on my desk. I told myself I was just being nostalgic, but I found myself looking at them frequently over the following weeks. There was something about them that nagged at me, some quality that suggested they weren't entirely products of a child's imagination. A month later, I decided to drive up to Vermont to visit the old house. My mother had sold it years earlier to a young couple with children, and I hadn't been back since the day we moved her belongings out. I told myself I was just being sentimental, wanting to see the place where I'd grown up one more time. But I think I was really going there to look at those woods again, to see if I could remember what had inspired those drawings. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but well maintained. The new owners had painted it a different color and added a deck off the back, but it was recognizably the same place. I parked on the road and walked up the driveway, planning to knock on the door and ask if I could look around. But as I approached the house, I could see into the backyard, and I stopped walking. There was a child's swing set on the lawn, and a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was sitting on one of the swings. She wasn't swinging, but just sitting there facing the woods, with her feet dragging in the dirt. When she heard my footsteps on the gravel, she turned to look at me. She asked. The question caught me off guard. I asked. "My mom told me about you," she said. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Instead of answering, she pointed toward the edge of the woods. "He's there sometimes, in the afternoon when the sun gets low." I looked where she was pointing, but I saw only trees and shadows. "Really tall," she said, holding her hand up above her head, "and thin, and his arms are too long." Her mother came out of the house then, a woman in her 30s who looked apologetic and slightly embarrassed. "Emma, don't bother the man with your stories," she said, then looked at me. I explained who I was and asked if I could look around the property. She was friendly enough, though I could see her watching Emma with the particular concern of a parent who's heard too many strange stories from their child. We talked for a few minutes about the house and the neighborhood, and eventually I worked up the courage to ask about what Emma had said. "Oh, the tall man," her mother said with a tired laugh. "That's been going on for about a year now. She's convinced there's someone in the woods who watches her when she plays outside. We've walked through there dozens of times, never found anything." I asked. The mother looked surprised. "How did you know that?" "Yes, she draws him constantly. Always the same thing, this impossibly tall figure standing in the trees." I asked if I could see the drawings, and she invited me inside. Emma's artwork was displayed on the refrigerator and bulletin board in the kitchen, mixed in with school assignments and family photos. But scattered among the typical childhood subjects were several drawings that made my hands shake slightly as I looked at them. They were nearly identical to the ones I had drawn 30 years earlier. The same impossibly tall, thin figure, the same careful attention to proportion and scale, the same sense that the artist was trying very hard to document something real rather than create something imaginary. Emma had even used colored pencils, just as I had, and her technique was remarkably similar to my own childhood style. "These are very detailed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She spends a lot of time on them," her mother replied. I asked if I could walk through the woods, and Emma immediately volunteered to show me where she usually saw the tall man. Her mother agreed, though she insisted on coming with us. The three of us walked across the backyard to the edge of the forest, following a path that I remembered making myself decades earlier. The woods looked much the same as they had when I was a child, mixed hardwoods with thick undergrowth, crossed by old stone walls that marked property boundaries from when the area had been farmland. Emma led us to a small clearing about 100 yards from the house, a circular space maybe 20 feet across, where very little grew beneath the canopy. "This is where I see him most," she said, pointing to a spot at the far edge of the clearing. "He stands right there, between those two big oak trees. Sometimes he's there when I come out to play. Sometimes he shows up while I'm playing. But he never moves." I looked at the spot she indicated. The two oak trees were massive, probably over 100 years old, and they created a natural frame that would perfectly silhouette a tall figure standing between them. The late afternoon light was filtering through the leaves in exactly the way I remembered from my childhood, creating shifting patterns of shadow and brightness that could easily trick the eye. But as I stood there, I began to feel the same unease I had experienced as a child. There was something about that particular spot, something about the way the shadows fell between those trees that seemed to draw the eye and hold it. I found myself staring at the space between the oaks, waiting for something to move or change or reveal itself. Emma asked. I looked more carefully, letting my eyes adjust to the interplay of light and shadow. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A vertical line that seemed too straight to be natural, a pale shape that might have been a face catching the filtered sunlight. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there but trees and shadows. I'm not sure, I said honestly. We walked around the clearing for a few more minutes, and I took some photos of the area with my phone. Emma showed me other spots where she had seen the tall man, always at the edge of clearings, always standing motionless among the trees. Her descriptions were remarkably consistent and surprisingly detailed for a child her age. As we walked back to the house, Emma's mother asked me quietly if I had ever seen anything unusual in those woods when I was a child. I hesitated, then told her about my own drawings, about my own childhood conviction that someone watched me from among the trees. She looked troubled but not entirely surprised. I've been thinking about having the woods surveyed, she said. Maybe there's something back there, an old building foundation, or some kind of structure that creates unusual shadows. She trailed off, shaking her head. I gave her my contact information and asked her to let me know if Emma saw anything else unusual. Then I drove home, thinking about those drawings and the strange consistency of a child's vision across decades. That night, I scanned Emma's drawings and compared them side by side with my own childhood artwork. The similarities were remarkable, not just in subject matter, but in style, perspective, and attention to detail. It was as if we had both been trying to document the same phenomenon, separated by 30 years, but united by a shared vision of something that lived in the shadows between the trees. I started researching the history of that area, looking for any reports of unusual sightings or unexplained phenomena. I found a few scattered accounts over the decades. Hikers who reported seeing a tall figure watching them from the forest, children who drew pictures of a thin man who lived in the woods, local folklore about something that wandered the mountains. None of it was definitive, but there was a pattern, a consistency that suggested something more than childhood imagination or adult misperception. 3 months later, Emma's mother called me. Emma had stopped talking about the tall man, stopped drawing pictures of him. When her mother asked why, Emma said simply that he wasn't there anymore, that he had gone somewhere else. The woods behind their house felt different now, she said, emptier. I drove up to Vermont the following weekend and walked through the forest again. Emma was right. Something had changed. The oppressive feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by the normal, peaceful atmosphere of a woodland afternoon. The clearing where Emma had seen the tall man felt like just another spot in the forest, no longer charged with the strange energy that had made it seem significant. Not that he had never existed, not that she had stopped imagining him. He had gone somewhere else, as if he were real, as if he had agency, as if he were capable of making decisions about where to be and when to be seen. I still have those drawings, both mine and photocopies of Emma's. Sometimes I look at them and try to convince myself that they're just the products of overactive childhood imaginations, influenced by shadows and stories and the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But the consistency is too striking, the details too specific, the timing too coincidental. Something lives in those woods, something that watches children at play and inspires them to document what they see with careful, precise drawings. Something that exists at the edges of vision and understanding, revealing itself only to those young enough to accept what they see without demanding explanations. I don't know what it is, but I know it's real. And somewhere, in some other forest, some other child is probably drawing pictures of a tall, thin figure standing among the trees, trying to show the adults in their life something that can't be explained but can't be ignored. I still check the flashlight batteries every few weeks, even though it's been almost 5 years since that night. My wife thinks it's excessive, but she wasn't standing in the backyard with me when everything went dark. She was inside, reading on the couch, completely unaware that something had just changed the way I understood the world. It was early October 2020, a Saturday evening just after sunset. I remember the date exactly because it was our wedding anniversary, our 15th, and we'd spent the day hiking in the state forest about 30 miles from our house. We live in a small town in northern Wisconsin, the kind of place where you know your neighbors, and the biggest excitement is usually the high school football game on Friday nights. Our house sits on about 2 acres at the edge of town, backing up to a thick stand of oak and maple trees that connects to several hundred acres of undeveloped woodland. Sarah had gone inside to start dinner, while I stayed out back to clean up the camping gear we'd used on our hike. The air had that crisp feeling that comes with the first real cold snap of fall, and the leaves were just starting to turn. I was enjoying the quiet and the fresh air, taking my time organizing our backpacks and checking the tent for any damage from the day's use. The sun had set about 20 minutes earlier, and the sky was that deep purple color that comes just before full darkness. I could see the first stars beginning to appear, and the trees at the back of our property were dark silhouettes against the sky. It was peaceful in the way that only rural evenings can be. No traffic sounds, no city noise, just the distant call of geese heading south and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I was rolling up our sleeping bags when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it might be an airplane. There's a regional airport about 40 miles away, and we occasionally see aircraft passing overhead, especially on clear nights when their lights are visible from a long distance. But this light was different. It was larger and brighter than any airplane light I'd ever seen, and instead of blinking or moving in a straight line across the sky, it appeared to be descending slowly toward the tree line behind our property. I stopped what I was doing and watched more carefully. The light was white with a slight blue tinge, perfectly round and completely silent. It was maybe half a mile away, moving with a deliberate, controlled descent that definitely wasn't characteristic of any aircraft I was familiar with. There was no sound of engines. No navigation lights, no beam of light extending downward like you'd expect from a helicopter or search aircraft. As it got closer to the trees, I could see that it was quite large, maybe the size of a school bus, though it was difficult to judge scale in the growing darkness. The light seemed to come from the entire surface of whatever it was, not from specific points or sources. It glowed with a steady, even illumination that didn't flicker or vary in intensity. I found myself walking toward the back of our property, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense that I was witnessing something extraordinary. The object continued its slow descent, moving with the kind of purposeful control that suggested intelligence rather than physics. It wasn't falling or drifting, it was clearly being guided by some kind of conscious intent. When it reached the tree line, about a quarter-mile from where I was standing, it seemed to pause for a moment, hovering just above the canopy. I could see the tops of the trees illuminated by its glow, casting strange shadows that shifted and moved as the light pulsed very gently, like slow breathing. Then, without any change in the quality of its light or the silence of its movement, it settled down into the forest and disappeared behind the trees. For several minutes, I could see a faint glow filtering up through the branches, like sunlight through a forest canopy, but softer and more diffused. The light seemed to move or shift position occasionally, as if whatever was producing it was exploring the area where it had landed. I stood at the edge of our property, straining to see more clearly, but the trees were too thick to make out any details. I was trying to decide whether to go into the house and get a flashlight, maybe try to get closer to investigate, when everything went dark. The power failure was instantaneous and complete. The porch light went out, the glow from our kitchen window disappeared, and even the distant streetlights that were visible through the trees on the other side of our house vanished simultaneously. But it wasn't just our house. Looking around, I could see that the entire area had lost power. The few neighbors' houses that were visible in the distance were all dark, and even the red warning light on the radio tower several miles away had gone out. What struck me immediately was how quiet it became. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how much background noise came from electrical devices, the hum of air conditioners, the buzz of transformers, the distant sound of motors and fans. When all of that stopped at once, the silence was profound and somehow unnatural. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. I stood in the darkness, looking toward the tree line where I'd seen the object disappear. The glow was still there, but it seemed brighter now, more noticeable against the backdrop of a world that had suddenly lost all its artificial illumination. It pulsed slowly, regularly, like a heartbeat made of light, casting faint shadows that moved through the forest in patterns I couldn't quite follow. Sarah called to me from the house, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The power's out," she said, which seemed like an understatement given the circumstances. I told her I'd be right in, but I couldn't tear myself away from watching that strange glow in the trees. Something about it felt important, like I was witnessing something that would only happen once, something I needed to remember exactly. The glow continued for maybe 20 more minutes, pulsing and shifting position occasionally. Sometimes it seemed to be moving deeper into the forest, sometimes closer to the edge where I could see it more clearly. There was a pattern to its movement, a purposefulness that suggested it was searching for something, or perhaps studying the area where it had landed. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the glow began to rise. I could see it moving up through the trees, growing brighter as it cleared the canopy. The object, whatever it was, lifted slowly from the forest with the same controlled, deliberate movement it had shown during its descent. It rose straight up for maybe 100 feet, then began to move horizontally, drifting away toward the northeast at a steady, unhurried pace. I watched it until it disappeared over the horizon, a bright point of light moving silently through the star-filled sky. When it was gone, the darkness seemed deeper than before, more complete. I stood in our backyard for several more minutes, listening to the profound silence and trying to process what I had just witnessed. The power came back on about an hour later, all at once, just as it had gone out. The porch light flickered on, the house filled with the familiar hum of electrical devices, and the normal sounds of a modern evening resumed. But by then I was inside, sitting at the kitchen table with Sarah, trying to explain what I had seen. She listened without interrupting, though I could see the skepticism in her eyes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Maybe it was some kind of military exercise, she said finally. I nodded and agreed that those were all possibilities, but I knew what I had seen, and it didn't fit any of those explanations. The next morning, I walked out to the tree line to see if I could find any trace of where the object had landed. The forest floor was covered with fallen leaves, and I searched for maybe an hour, looking for any sign of disturbance, broken branches, scorched ground, impressions in the earth. But I found nothing unusual. The woods looked exactly as they always had, peaceful and undisturbed. I called the power company to ask about the outage, claiming I was concerned about my computer equipment. The customer service representative told me that they had experienced a brief system failure that affected about a 50 square mile area, but that it had been resolved quickly. When I asked what had caused it, she said it was listed as equipment malfunction, but couldn't provide any more details. Over the following weeks, I found myself checking the local newspaper and online news sites, looking for any reports of unusual sightings or unexplained phenomena. But there was nothing. If anyone else had seen what I saw that night, they weren't talking about it publicly. I've thought about that experience countless times since then, turning it over in my mind, examining it from every angle I can think of. I've considered all the rational explanations, experimental aircraft, weather phenomena, some kind of elaborate hoax, but none of them adequately account for what I observed. The object was too large, too controlled, too purposeful to be explained by conventional means. What bothers me most is the power failure. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. It happened the moment the object settled into the forest, and it affected a huge area simultaneously. That suggests a level of technological capability that's far beyond anything I'm aware of in the public realm. Whatever I saw that night, it had the ability to disrupt our electrical grid from a distance, which implies a level of advancement that makes me wonder who or what was operating it. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and I'm looking out the back windows toward the tree line, I find myself hoping to see that glow again. Not because I want to be frightened or confused, but because I want to understand. What was it doing in our forest? What was it looking for? And most importantly, will it come back? I keep that flashlight ready, and I make sure the batteries are fresh, because if it does return, I want to be prepared. I want to be ready to see clearly, to remember everything, to be a good witness to whatever it is that visits us in the darkness between the known and the unknown. I keep a road atlas in my glove compartment now, the kind with every small town marked, every back road traced in thin blue lines. I study it sometimes when I'm parked somewhere, running my finger along the highways of Nevada, looking for a place that I know isn't there, but that I can't stop searching for. It's been 2 years since I took that detour, and I still wake up some nights wondering if I dreamed the whole thing. I was driving from Phoenix to Reno in July of 2022, a trip I'd made dozens of times for work. I sold industrial equipment to mining companies, and that route through Nevada was as familiar to me as my own driveway. Usually, I took Interstate 80 straight across, but that day there had been a massive pileup near Winnemucca that had traffic backed up for miles. The radio was reporting delays of 4 hours or more. I was already running late for a meeting the next morning, so I decided to take one of the back roads that cut north through the desert. I'd done it once before, years earlier, following Highway 361 up through the Toyab Range. It was longer in terms of miles, but usually faster than sitting in traffic, and I enjoyed the solitude of those empty desert highways. The day was typical for that part of Nevada in summer, blazing hot, not a cloud in the sky, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and dance in the distance. I had the air conditioning running full blast and a cooler full of water bottles on the back seat. The landscape was exactly what you'd expect: sagebrush and Joshua trees scattered across red-brown earth that stretched to distant mountains on all sides. For the first hour, everything was routine. I passed the occasional ranch gate, a few abandoned buildings that might once have been mining claims, the rusted remains of old cars that people had dumped out there decades ago. The radio gradually faded to static as I got farther from civilization, so I drove in silence, letting my mind wander. It was around 2 in the afternoon when I noticed the road sign. It was newer than most of the signs in that area, clean white metal with green lettering that read Esperanza 12 miles, with an arrow pointing left onto a paved road that I didn't remember being there before. I slowed down and looked at my GPS, but it showed nothing but empty desert in that direction. No roads, no towns, nothing. I should point out that I knew this area reasonably well. I'd driven through here before, and I'd studied the maps plenty of times. There wasn't supposed to be anything called Esperanza anywhere in central Nevada, but the sign was there, official looking and recently installed, pointing toward what appeared to be a well-maintained 2-lane road disappearing into the desert. I sat at that intersection for several minutes, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. My rational mind said to ignore the sign and stick to my planned route, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was a new development, some kind of resort or mining operation that had been built since I'd last been through the area. The road looked good, better than the highway I'd been following, and 12 miles wasn't that far out of the way. I turned left and followed the road toward Esperanza. The pavement was smooth and recently laid, with fresh yellow lines down the center. There were no potholes, no cracks, none of the wear you'd expect from a desert road. It curved gently through low hills covered in sage and creosote, following the natural contours of the land in a way that suggested careful engineering. Every few miles, there were smaller signs confirming that I was still headed toward Esperanza, each one counting down the distance. What struck me as odd was how the landscape seemed to change as I drove deeper into the desert. The vegetation was subtly different, lusher somehow, with plants I didn't recognize mixed in among the familiar desert flora. The air coming through my vents seemed cooler and more humid than it should have been. Even the quality of the light seemed different, softer, and more golden than the harsh glare I was used to in that part of Nevada. When I crested a small rise about 10 miles in, I saw the town spread out in the valley below me. Esperanza was laid out in a perfect grid, maybe 30 or 40 buildings, arranged along tree-lined streets that formed neat rectangular blocks. From my vantage point on the hill, it looked like a movie set version of a small American town. White church steeple, main street with storefronts, residential neighborhoods with lawns and gardens. What made it seem unreal was how clean and orderly everything appeared, like it had been built yesterday and maintained by people who took enormous pride in their work. But what really caught my attention was that the town was completely empty. There were no cars on the streets, no people walking on the sidewalks, no signs of movement anywhere. The traffic lights at the main intersection were working, cycling through their colors in perfect sequence, but there was no traffic to direct. Street lamps lined the roads even though it was the middle of the day. Everything looked functional and ready for use, but there was no one there to use it. The storefronts were clean and well maintained, with attractive displays in the windows, but I couldn't see anyone inside. The parking spaces along the street were all empty, marked with fresh white paint on clean asphalt. The residential streets were equally deserted, but beautifully maintained. The houses were modest, but well kept, with manicured lawns that somehow stayed green despite the desert location. Gardens bloomed with flowers that shouldn't have been able to survive in that climate. Children's bicycles were parked in driveways. Sprinklers ran on automatic timers. Mailboxes stood ready to receive deliveries. But there were no children, no homeowners, no mail carriers. I parked in front of what appeared to be the town hall, a small brick building with an American flags hanging limp in the still air. The silence was profound. No air conditioners humming, no dogs barking, no distant traffic. Just the soft ticking of my engine cooling and the whisper of a breeze through leaves that shouldn't have existed in that desert. I got out of the car and walked up to the front door of the town hall. It was unlocked. Inside, I found a clean, functional office with desks and filing cabinets and computers that were turned on but not being used. There were coffee cups sitting on desks, still warm. A calendar on the wall showed the correct date. Everything suggested that people had been there recently, maybe just moments before I arrived. But now they were gone. I tried the cafe next door. The door chimed as I entered, and I could smell fresh coffee and baked goods. The cash register was on, the menu boards were filled with daily specials, and there were newspapers from that morning stacked by the door. But the dining room was empty, chairs neatly pushed under tables, place settings arranged for customers who never came. For the next hour, I walked through Esperanza like a ghost, touring a world that existed parallel to my own. Every building I entered was the same, clean, functional, recently used, but completely abandoned. The library had books checked out that were due back that day. The gas station had pumps that worked, and a convenience store stocked with fresh food. The school had classrooms set up for lessons, homework assignments written on blackboards, but no students or teachers anywhere. What disturbed me most was how normal everything looked. This wasn't some kind of disaster area or hastily abandoned settlement. It was a functioning town that simply had no people in it, as if everyone had vanished between one moment and the next, leaving their lives suspended in perfect order. As the afternoon wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The town was too perfect, too clean, too ready for a population that didn't exist. I kept expecting to encounter someone, a caretaker, a security guard, anyone who could explain what this place was. But the streets remained empty, the buildings silent. Around 5 o'clock, I decided I needed to leave. The sun was getting lower, and I didn't want to be driving unfamiliar desert roads in the dark. I walked back to my car, which was still the only vehicle on the main street, and got ready to head back to the highway. That's when I noticed that the street signs had changed. When I'd arrived, all the signs had been in English: Main Street, Oak Avenue, First Street. Now they displayed names I didn't recognize in what looked like Spanish, but not quite Spanish. The characters were familiar, but the words were foreign to me. Even more unsettling, the buildings themselves looked subtly different. The storefronts had different names. The architectural details seemed more elaborate. The whole town had shifted somehow while I wasn't paying attention. I drove quickly through the streets, trying to find my way back to the road I'd come in on. But the layout of the town seemed to have changed as well. Streets that I remembered as straight now curved in unexpected directions. Intersections that had been simple four-way stops now had complex traffic patterns. I felt like I was navigating a maze that was rearranging itself around me. Finally, more by luck than navigation, I found a road that led out of town toward the hills. I didn't know if it was the same road I'd come in on, but it was paved, and it was heading away from Esperanza, which was all I cared about at that point. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look back until I was well clear of the valley. When I reached the top of the hill and looked back, the town was gone. The valley was empty desert, nothing but sagebrush and sand stretching to the distant mountains. There were no buildings, no streets, no signs that anything had ever been there. It was as if Esperanza had never existed. I drove back to the main highway in a state of bewildered confusion. When I reached the intersection where I'd first seen the sign, there was no sign. The road I'd followed into the desert was gone, replaced by unbroken wilderness. My GPS showed that I was exactly where I expected to be, following the route I'd planned from the beginning. I've never found any record of a town called Esperanza in that part of Nevada. I've searched online databases, historical records, geological surveys, everything I can think of. I've driven that same route several times since then, always looking for the intersection, the sign, any trace of the road that led me to that impossible place. But there's nothing there, nothing that suggests I ever deviated from the highway at all. Sometimes I wonder if I fell asleep while driving and dreamed the whole experience. But I remember every detail with crystal clarity: the smell of the coffee in the cafe, the sound of my footsteps on the empty sidewalks, the feeling of door handles turning under my hand. It was too real, too consistent, too complete to have been a dream. I think about the people who should have been living in Esperanza, going about their daily lives in that perfect little town. Where were they? Where did they go when I arrived? And where did they come from when I left? Were they ever there at all? Or was the town just waiting, maintaining itself for inhabitants who existed in some other time or place? The desert keeps its secrets, and I've learned not to ask too many questions about things I can't understand. But late at night, when I'm driving alone through empty country, I sometimes catch myself looking for road signs that point toward places that shouldn't exist, toward towns that exist only in the spaces between what we think we know about the world and what the world actually contains. I've never told this story to anyone who didn't already know me well, because I know how it sounds. Even now, sitting here trying to put it into words, I can feel that familiar tightness in my chest. The same feeling I had that night when I kept checking the rearview mirror, hoping I wouldn't see what I knew would still be there. This happened in the winter of 2019 on a stretch of Highway 287 that cuts through the high desert between Amarillo and Denver. My wife Sarah and I were driving back from her sister's wedding in Texas, taking the northern route because we wanted to avoid the interstate traffic. It was late February, one of those clear, cold nights when the stars seem close enough to touch and the horizon stretches out forever in all directions. We'd left Amarillo around 9:30, planning to drive straight through to Denver. Sarah was asleep in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the window, and I had the radio turned down low to some late-night talk show that was discussing conspiracy theories. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. At the time, I was only half listening, more focused on the hypnotic rhythm of the white lines disappearing under our headlights. The highway through that part of the country is lonely in a way that city people don't understand. For miles at a time, you might not see another car, another light, another sign that anyone else exists in the world. It's just you and the road and the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. Some people find it unsettling, but I'd always found it peaceful. There's something comforting about being a single point of light, moving through all that emptiness. We were maybe 20 miles north of Dumas when I first noticed it in my peripheral vision, a light off to the east, roughly parallel to the highway. At first glance, it looked like it might be an airplane, bright white with just a hint of blue, moving at what seemed like a reasonable speed for aircraft. But something about it nagged at me. The light was too steady, too focused. Airplane lights blink, or at least vary in intensity, as they move through the sky. This one maintained the same brightness, the same color, the same perfectly round shape. I kept glancing over at it as I drove, trying to figure out what I was seeing. It stayed roughly the same distance from the highway, maybe a mile or two out across the prairie, and it seemed to be keeping pace with us. When I sped up slightly to test my theory, the light seemed to speed up as well. When I slowed down, it slowed down. But the changes were subtle enough that I told myself I was imagining things. Sarah stirred in her sleep and shifted position, and I looked away from the light for a few moments to make sure she was comfortable. When I looked back, the light was closer to the road, maybe half a mile out now, and it was definitely keeping pace with us. I could see it more clearly. It was perfectly spherical, about the size of a basketball if you held it at arm's length, and it cast no beam of light downward despite its brightness. It simply existed, a ball of clean, white light moving silently across the dark landscape. I considered waking Sarah, but she'd been dealing with morning sickness. She was about 3 months pregnant with our first child, and she needed the rest. Besides, I still wasn't entirely convinced that what I was seeing was anything more than an unusual aircraft, or maybe some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. I'd heard of ball lightning and similar things. Maybe this was something along those lines. But as the miles passed, it became harder to maintain that rational explanation. The light never wavered, never changed course, never showed any of the characteristics I would expect from a natural phenomenon. It simply stayed with us, matching our speed exactly, maintaining the same distance from the road. Sometimes it would drift a little closer, sometimes a little farther away, but it never disappeared behind hills or trees the way a ground-based light source would. After about 10 miles of this, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I turned off the radio and drove in silence, checking the speedometer obsessively. We were doing a steady 70 miles per hour, and the light was keeping perfect pace. No airplane flies that slowly. No helicopter could maintain that kind of steady flight pattern for that long without making any sound that I could hear. I tried the various tests. I would speed up to 80, then slow down to 60. The light adjusted accordingly every time. I would take my foot off the gas and let the car coast down hills, then accelerate up the other side. The light never fell behind or pulled ahead. It was as if we were connected by an invisible string, moving through the night together. The strangest part was how steady it remained. In my rearview mirror, I could see our own headlights bouncing slightly as we hit small bumps in the road, swaying gently as we took curves. But the light outside maintained perfect stability, as if it were following a road that was smoother than the one we were actually driving on. About 30 miles into this strange procession, we came to a small town, just a cluster of houses and a gas station around a crossroads. I thought about stopping, maybe waking Sarah and pointing out the light, maybe calling someone. But who would I call, and what would I say? As we passed through the town, I watched carefully to see if the light would behave differently, maybe seek out the populated area, or react to the presence of other people, but it simply continued on its parallel course, ignoring the town completely. It was past midnight now, and the highway had become even lonelier. We hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The landscape was flat and featureless, broken only by the occasional ranch gate or irrigation canal. In that vast emptiness, the light seemed like the only other living thing for hundreds of miles. I started talking to it under my breath, which I realize sounds crazy. But the silence in the car was becoming oppressive, and I needed to hear something, even if it was just my own voice. I whispered. Of course, there was no answer, just the steady presence of that impossible light keeping us company through the darkness. Around 1:30, I noticed that the light was gradually moving closer to the highway. The change was so slow that I might not have noticed it if I hadn't been watching so intently, but over the course of several miles, it had definitely closed the distance. Now it was maybe a quarter mile from the road, close enough that I could see it was casting a very faint glow on the ground beneath it, though still no beam or cone of light. This was when I started to feel genuinely frightened. Up until that point, I had been curious, puzzled, even excited by the mystery of it. But as the light drew closer, some primitive part of my brain began sending alarm signals. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, checking the locks on the doors, glancing at Sarah to make sure she was still breathing normally. The light continued to close the distance, moving with the same deliberate patience it had shown all along. When it was maybe 100 yards from the highway, I could see that it was larger than I had initially thought. Not basketball sized, but more like a small car, perfectly spherical and glowing with that clean, steady light. There was still no sound, no disturbance of the air, no sign that it was affecting the physical world around it in any way. I don't know what I would have done if it had come all the way to the road. Fortunately, I never had to find out. Just as the light seemed about to reach the highway, it stopped. For several miles, it maintained that position, maybe 50 yards from the pavement, keeping perfect pace with us, but coming no closer. I could see it clearly now in my peripheral vision, a bright sphere moving silently through the night. Then, without any warning or change in behavior, it simply rose straight up into the sky and disappeared. One moment it was there, solid and bright and undeniably real, and the next moment it was gone, leaving nothing but the vast darkness and the memory of something impossible. I drove in stunned silence for several more miles, checking the mirrors constantly, waiting for it to reappear. But the night remained empty. Eventually, Sarah woke up and asked how much farther we had to go. I told her we were making good time, and she went back to sleep. I never mentioned the light. We reached Denver around 6 in the morning, just as the sun was coming up over the eastern plains. In daylight, the whole experience seemed like something that might have been a dream, except that I was wide awake and could remember every detail with perfect clarity. I had been watching that light for over 40 miles, for more than an hour of driving. It had not been a hallucination or a trick of tired eyes. In the weeks that followed, I found myself researching everything I could about unusual lights, atmospheric phenomena, military aircraft, anything that might explain what I had seen. I read about ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, temperature inversions, experimental aircraft, weather balloons. None of it fit. What I had seen was too controlled, too purposeful, too responsive to our movements to be any natural phenomenon I could find described in the literature. Sarah and I now have 2 children, and we've driven that stretch of highway several times since that night, always during the day. The landscape looks different in daylight, more ordinary, more explainable. It's hard to imagine anything mysterious happening in all that open space under the bright sun. But I remember what it felt like that night, driving through the darkness with something impossible keeping pace beside us. I still don't know what it was. I've considered every rational explanation I can think of, and none of them adequately account for what I experienced. Maybe it was some kind of experimental military technology. Maybe it was a natural phenomenon that science hasn't fully explained yet. Maybe it was something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into any category we have names for. What I do know is that we are not alone out here, not in the way we think we are. There are things moving through the night that don't follow the rules we've built our understanding of the world around. They're not necessarily hostile or threatening. The light that followed us seemed more curious than anything else, like it was simply observing, trying to understand what we were and where we were going. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I find myself checking the mirrors more often than I need to, scanning the horizon for lights that move too steadily or follow too closely. I've never seen anything like it again, but I know it's out there somewhere, moving through the darkness, keeping its own mysterious pace through the vast emptiness of the night. I still think about that night every time I see a body of water after dark. It was 3 years ago, maybe four now. Time has a way of blurring when you're trying to forget something that refuses to be forgotten. I'd driven up to Millfield Lake on a Thursday evening in late September when the air had that first real bite of autumn and the leaves were just starting to turn. The lake was about 2 hours north of where I lived then, tucked away in a valley between low hills covered in pine and oak. I'd been there a few times before, always during the day, always with other people, but that night I wanted to be alone. My divorce had been finalized the week before, and I needed the kind of silence you can only find in places where civilization feels like a distant memory. Night fishing had always been something I'd wanted to try, but never had the courage for. There's something about being on the water in the dark that most people find unsettling, but I thought it might be exactly what I needed. Just me, the lake, and whatever fish were willing to bite. I launched my small aluminum boat from the public ramp just as the sun was setting. The water was glass smooth, reflecting that orange and purple sky so perfectly it looked like I was floating through clouds. The lake wasn't large, maybe a mile across at its widest point, but it was deep, fed by underground springs that kept it cold even in summer. Local legend said it was bottomless, though I knew that was just the kind of story people tell about any body of water that's dark enough to hide its secrets. By the time I'd motored out to what I thought would be a good spot, near a fallen tree that created a natural reef about 30 yards from the eastern shore, full darkness had settled over everything. I cut the engine and let the boat drift while I set up my gear. The silence was immediate and complete. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the gentle lap of water against the hull and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. I dropped anchor and cast my line using night crawlers and a simple sinker rig. The water was so still that I could hear the soft plop of my bait hitting the surface, followed by the barely perceptible sound of the sinker pulling it down into the depths. I settled back against the stern, rod in hand, and let myself sink into the rhythm of waiting that every fisherman knows. For the first hour, everything was exactly as I'd hoped it would be. The stress of the past months seemed to dissolve into the darkness around me. Occasionally, a fish would jump somewhere out in the lake, sending ripples across the surface that caught the starlight. I'd brought a small cooler with sandwiches and coffee, and I ate slowly, savoring both the food and the solitude. This was healing, I thought. This was what I needed. It was sometime after 10 o'clock when I first noticed the other boat. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of tired eyes straining to see in the darkness. But when I looked more carefully, I could make out a dark shape on the water, maybe 200 yards away, near the opposite shore. It was roughly the same size as my boat, though I couldn't make out any details. What struck me immediately was how still it was. No movement, no sound of an engine, no voices. Just sitting there on the water, like it had been there all along. I watched it for several minutes, waiting for some sign of life, a flashlight, the sound of someone casting a line, anything to indicate that it was occupied by another night fisherman like myself. But there was nothing. The boat sat motionless on the perfectly calm water, a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the distant shore. My rational mind offered reasonable explanations. Maybe it was just an empty boat that had broken free from a mooring somewhere. Maybe there was someone in it who was being as quiet as I was, respecting the silence of the night. Maybe it was just a log or some other piece of debris that my tired brain was interpreting as a boat. But something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I tried to focus on my fishing, but I found myself glancing over at the other boat every few minutes. It never moved, never changed position, never showed any sign that it was anything more than a dark shape on the water. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow aware of me, watching me with the same intensity that I was watching it. Around 11:30, I got my first bite of the night. The tip of my rod dipped sharply, then began to pulse with the unmistakable rhythm of a fish fighting the hook. I concentrated on reeling it in, grateful for the distraction. It felt like a decent-sized bass putting up a good fight in the cold water. When I finally brought it to the surface, it was a beautiful largemouth, probably 3 pounds, its scales catching the faint starlight as it thrashed beside the boat. I was in the process of unhooking it when I heard the sound. It was low and sustained, like a hum or a drone, but with an odd quality that made it seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, I thought it might be a distant airplane, but it was too constant, too unchanging. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the other boat, but I couldn't be sure. The sound was barely audible, right at the edge of hearing, but it had a penetrating quality that seemed to vibrate through the water and up through the hull of my boat. I held still, the fish forgotten in my hands, and listened. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded away so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it stopped. The silence that followed seemed deeper than before, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I looked toward the other boat, but it was still there, still motionless. I couldn't tell if the sound had come from it or not. For a moment, I considered starting my engine and motoring over to investigate, but something held me back. The rational part of my mind said it was probably just another fisherman, maybe using some kind of electronic fish finder that made unusual sounds. But there was another part of me, deeper and more primitive, that said to stay away. I released the base back into the water and cast my line again, but my concentration was broken. Every few minutes, I would hear that sound again, always low, always sustained, always seeming to come from everywhere. Sometimes it lasted for 20 or 30 seconds, sometimes just a few. There was no pattern to it that I could discern, no rhythm or repetition. It was as if the lake itself was humming, some deep song rising from its hidden depths. The other boat never moved. In 3 hours of watching, It had maintained the exact same position, never drifting with whatever current there might be, never adjusting its angle to the shore. It sat on the water with an impossible stillness, as if it were anchored not just to the bottom, but to the very fabric of the night itself. By 2 in the morning, I had caught 2 more fish, but I was no longer enjoying the experience. The mysterious sound had become more frequent, sometimes occurring every few minutes, and I found myself tensing each time it began, waiting for it to stop. There was something about it that felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain, not threatening exactly, but alien, as if it belonged to a different world than the one I knew. I decided to leave. I reeled in my line and secured my gear, trying to move quietly, though I wasn't sure why stealth seemed important. As I prepared to start the engine, I took one last look at the other boat. It was still there, still perfectly motionless, but now I thought I could see something else. A faint glow coming from within it, so dim that I might have been imagining it. It wasn't the harsh white light of a flashlight or the warm yellow of a lantern. It was something else, something that seemed to pulse very slowly, like a heartbeat made of light. I started my engine, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence, and began the trip back to shore. As I motored away, I found myself looking back over my shoulder every few seconds. The other boat remained where it was, but the glow seemed to be getting brighter, though that might have been a trick of distance and darkness. The humming sound followed me halfway across the lake before finally fading away. I loaded my boat onto the trailer and drove home in a state of confused unease. I told myself that I had simply encountered another night fisherman who happened to be using some kind of equipment I wasn't familiar with. People fish differently, use different techniques, different tools. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything I had witnessed. But I never went back to Millfield Lake, and I never went night fishing again. In the years since, I've tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than an overactive imagination triggered by stress and solitude. But late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still hear that sound, that low, sustained humming that seemed to come from the depths of the water itself. And I still wonder about that boat, sitting motionless on the dark water, glowing with its own strange light. Sometimes I think about driving back up there, just to see if it's still there, waiting in the darkness. But I never do. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. Whatever was out there that night, whatever I encountered on that quiet lake, it belongs to a world that touches ours only briefly, in moments when we find ourselves alone in places where the normal rules don't seem to apply. I still fish, but only during the day now, only on familiar waters where I can see the bottom and know what lies beneath. The night lake keeps its secrets, and I'm content to let it.